Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Somehow, the thing was like a gigantic plant, with innumerable roots, pale and swollen, that ramified from a bulbular hole. This bowl, half hidden from view, was topped with a vermilion cup like a monstrous blossom, and from the cup there grew an elfin figure, pearly-hued, and formed with exquisite beauty and symmetry, a figure that turned its Lilliputian face toward Haines and spoke in the sounding voice of Vulthoom. Vulthoom is an intelligent alien being first came to Mars in the distant past. Its appearance caused a civil war, as those who fell for its promises fought to establish it as the planet's ruler. This faction was eventually defeated, and Vulthoom, along with his surviving followers, retreated to the underground city of Ravormos, where it remains. The unausprechlichen Kulten identifies Vulthoom as a great old one, and one of the sons of Yog-Sothoth, along with Cthulhu and Hastar. The Ihai inhabit a collection of subterranean cities on Mars, regards Vulthoom as equivalent of Satan, though most humans believe it to be a myth. This trilogy by Ashton Smith explores humanity's encounter with Vulthoom and his sinister plan to conquer Earth. The Vaults of Yoh-Vombis by Ashton Smith. Weird Tales, May 1932. A powerful story of a nightmare horror, a weird vampirism spawned in the caverns of the Red Planet. Preface. As an intern in the terrestrial hospital at Ignar, I had charge of the singular case of Rodney 7, the one surviving member of the Octave expedition to Yoh-Vombis, and took down the following story from his dictation. 7 had been brought to the hospital by the Martian guides of the expedition. He was suffering from a horribly lacerated and inflamed condition of the scalp and brow, and was wildly delirious part of the time, and had to be held down in his bed during recurrent seizures of a mania whose violence was doubly inexplicable in view of his extreme debility. The lacerations, as will be learned from the story, were mainly self-inflicted. They were mingled with numerous small round wounds, easily distinguished from the knife slashes, and arranged in regular circles, through which an unknown poison had been injected into 7's scalp. The causation of these wounds was difficult to explain, unless one were to believe that 7's story was true and was no mere figment of his illness. Speaking for myself, in the light of what afterwards occurred, I feel that I have no other recourse than to believe it. There are strange things on the Red Planet, and I can only second the wish that was expressed by the doomed archaeologist in regard to future explorations. The night after he finished telling me his story, while another doctor than myself was supposedly on duty, 7 managed to escape from the hospital, doubtless in one of the strange seizures at which I have hinted, a most astonishing thing, for he had seemed weaker than ever after the long strain of his terrible narrative, and his demise had been hourly expected. More astonishing still, his bare footsteps were found in the desert, going toward Yoh-Vombis, till they vanished in the path of a light sandstorm, but no trace of 7 himself has yet been discovered. The narrative of Rodney 7. If the doctors are correct in their prognostication, I have only a few Martian hours of life remaining to me. In those hours I shall endeavor to relate, as a warning to others who might follow in our footsteps, the singular and frightful happenings that terminated our researches among the ruins of Yoh-Vombis. Somehow, even in my extremity, I shall contrive to tell the story, since there is no one else to do it. But the telling will be toilsome and broken, and after I am done, the madness will recur, and several men will restrain me. lest I should leave the hospital and return across many desert leagues to those abominable vaults beneath the compulsion of the malignant and malevolent virus which is permeating my brain. Perhaps death will release me from that abhorrent control which would urge me down to bottomless underworld warrens of terror for which the saner planets of the solar system can have no analogue. I say, perhaps, for remembering what I have seen, I am not sure that even death will end my bondage. There were 8 of us, professional archaeologists with more or less terrene and interplanetary experience, who set forth with native guides from Ignar, the commercial metropolis of Mars, to inspect that ancient, aeon-deserted city. Alan Octave, our official leader, held his primacy by virtue of knowing more about Martian archaeology than any other terrestrial on the planet, and others of the party, such as William Harper and Jonas Hallgren, had been associated with him in many of his previous researches. I, Rodney 7, was more of a newcomer, having spent but a few months on Mars, and the greater part of my own ultra-terrene delvings had been confined to Venus. I had often heard of Yoh-Vombis, in a vague and legendary sort of manner, and never at first hand. Even the ubiquitous Octave had never seen it. Builded by an extinct people whose history has been lost in the latter decadent eras of the planet, it remains a dim and fascinating riddle whose solution has never been approached, and which, I trust, may endure forevermore unsolved by man. Certainly I hope that no one will ever follow in our steps. Contrary to the impression we had received from Martian stories, we found that the semi-fabulous ruins lay at no great distance from Ignar, with its terrestrial colony and consulates. The nude, spongy-chested natives had spoken deterringly of vast deserts filled with ever-swirling sandstorms, through which we must pass to reach Yoh-Vombis. And in spite of our munificent offers of payment, it had been difficult to secure guides for the journey. We had provisioned ourselves amply, and had prepared for all emergencies that might eventuate during a long trip. Therefore, we were pleased as well as surprised when we came to the ruins after 7 hours of plodding across the flat, treeless, orange-yellow desolation to the southwest of Ignar. On account of the lesser gravity, the journey was far less tiring than one who is unfamiliar with Martian conditions might expect. But because of the thin, Himalaya-like air and the possible strain on our hearts, we had been careful not to hasten. Our coming to Yoh-Vombis was sudden and spectacular. Climbing the low slope of a league-long elevation of bare and deeply eroded stone, we saw before us the shattered walls of our destination, whose highest tower was notching the small remote sun that glared in stifled crimson through the floating haze of fine sand. For a little, we thought that the domeless, three-angled towers and broken-down monoliths were those of some unlegended city other than the one we sought. But the disposition of the ruins, which lay in a sort of arc for almost the entire extent of the low and Gneissic elevation, together with the type of architecture, soon convinced us that we had found our goal. No other ancient city on Mars had been laid out in that manner, and the strange, many-terraced buttresses of the thick walls, like the stairways of forgotten Anakim, were peculiar to the prehistoric race that had built Yoh-Vombis. Moreover, Yoh-Vombis was the one remaining example of this architecture, aside from a few fragments in the neighborhood of Ignar, which we had previously examined. I have seen the hoary, sky-confronting walls of Machu Picchu amid the desolate Andes, and the teocallis that are buried in the Mexican jungles, and I have seen the frozen, giant-builded battlements of Uogam on the glacial tundras of the nightward hemisphere of Venus. But these were as things of yesteryear, bearing at least the memory or the intimation of life, compared with the awesome and lethiferous antiquity, the cycle-enduring doom of a petrified sterility. That seemed to invest Yoh-Vombis. The whole region was far from the life-giving canals beyond, whose environs even the more noxious flora and fauna are seldom found, and we had seen no living thing since our departure from Ignar. But here, in this place of eternal bareness and solitude, It seemed that life could never have been. The stark, eroded stones were things that might have been reared by the toil of the dead to house the monstrous ghouls and demons of primal desolation. I think we all received the same impression as we stood staring in silence while the pale, Sanies-like sunset fell on the dark and megalithic ruins. I remember gasping a little, in an air that seemed to have been touched by the irrespirable chill of death, and I heard the same sharp, laborious intake of breath from others of our party. "That place is deader than an Egyptian morgue," observed Harper. "Certainly it is far more ancient," Octave assented. According to the most reliable legends, the Yohis, who built Yoh-Vombis, were wiped out by the present ruling race at least 40,000 years ago. "There's a story, isn't there," said Harper, "that the last remnant of the Yohis was destroyed by some unknown agency, something too horrible and outre to be mentioned even in a myth?" "Of course I've heard that legend," agreed Octave. "Maybe we'll find evidence among the ruins to prove or disprove it. The Yohis may have been cleaned out by some terrible epidemic, such as the Yashta pestilence, which was a kind of green mole that ate all the bones of the body, starting with the teeth and nails. But we needn't be afraid of getting it. If there are any mummies in Yoh-Vombis, the bacteria will all be dead as their victims, after so many cycles of planetary desiccation. Anyway, there ought to be a lot for us to learn. The Haines have always been more or less shy of the place. Few have ever visited it, and none, as far as I can find, have made a thorough examination of the ruins. The sun had gone down with uncanny swiftness, as if it had disappeared through some sort of prestidigitation rather than the normal process of setting. We felt the instant chill of the blue-green twilight, and the ether above us was like a huge transparent dome of sunless ice, shot with a million bleak sparklings that were the stars. We donned the coats and helmets of Martian fur, which must always be worn at night, and going on to westward of the walls, we established our camp in their lee, so that we might be sheltered a little from the jar. That cruel desert wind that always blows from the east before dawn. Then, lighting the alcohol lamps that had been brought along for cooking purposes, we huddled around them while the evening meal was prepared and eaten. Afterwards, for comfort rather than because of weariness, we retired early to our sleeping bags, and the two Haines, our guides, wrapped themselves in the cerement-like folds of grey bassa cloth, which are all the protection their leathery skins appear to require, even in sub-zero temperatures. Even in my thick, double-lined bag, I still felt the rigor of the night air, and I'm sure it was this, rather than anything else, which kept me awake for a long while and rendered my eventual slumber somewhat restless and broken. Of course, the strangeness of our situation, and the weird proximity of those Aeonian walls and towers, may in some measure have contributed to my unrest. But at any rate, I was not troubled by even the least presentiment of alarm or danger, and I should have laughed at the idea that anything of peril could lurk in Yoh-Vombis, amid whose undreamable and stupefying antiquities the very phantoms of its dead must long since have faded into nothingness. I remember little, however, except the feeling of interminable duration that often marks a shallow and interrupted sleep. I recall the marrow-piercing wind that moaned above us toward midnight, and the sand that stung my face like a fine hail as it passed, blowing from desert to immemorial desert. And I recall the still, inflexible stars that grew dim for a while with that fleeing ancient dust. Then the wind went by, and I drowsed again with starts of semi-wakefulness. At last, in one of these, I knew vaguely that the small twin moons, Phobos and Deimos, had risen and were making huge and spectral shadows with the ruins, and were casting an ashen glimmer on the shrouded forms of my companions. I must have been half asleep, for the memory of that which I saw is doubtful as any dream. I watched beneath drooping lids the tiny moons that had topped the domeless triangular towers, and I saw the far-flung shadows that almost touched the bodies of my fellow archaeologists. The whole scene was locked in a petrific stillness, and none of the sleepers stirred. Then, as my lids were about to close, I received an impression of movement in the frozen gloom, and it seemed to me that a portion of the foremost shadow had detached itself and was crawling toward Octave, who lay nearer to the ruins than we others. Even through my heavy lethargy, I was disturbed by a warning of something unnatural and perhaps ominous. I started to sit up, and even as I moved, the shadowy object, whatever it was, drew back and became merged once more in the greater shadow. Its vanishment startled me into full wakefulness, and yet I could not be sure that I had actually seen the thing. In that brief, final glimpse, it had seemed like a roughly circular piece of cloth or leather, dark and crumpled, and 12 or 14 inches in diameter, that ran along the ground with the doubling movement of an inchworm, causing it to fold and unfold in a startling manner as it went. I did not go to sleep again for nearly an hour, and if it had not been for the extreme cold, I should doubtless have gotten up to investigate and make sure whether I had really beheld an object of such bizarre nature or had merely dreamt it. I lay staring at the deep ebon shadow in which it had disappeared, while a series of fanciful wanderings followed each other in antic procession through my mind. Even then, though somewhat perturbed, I was not aware of any actual fear or intuition of possible menace. And more I began to convince myself that the thing was too unlikely and fantastical to have been anything but the figment of a dream. And at last I nodded off into light slumber. The chill, demoniac sighing of the jar across the jagged walls awoke me, and I saw that the faint moonlight had received the hueless accession of early dawn. We all arose, and prepared our breakfast with fingers that grew numb in spite of the spirit lamps. Then, shivering, we ate, while the sun leapt over the horizon like a juggler's ball. Enormous, gaunt, without gradations of shadow or luminosity, the ruins beetled before us in the thin light, like the mausolea of primordial giants that abide from darkness-eaten eons to confront the last dawn of an expiring orb. My queer visual experience during the night had taken on more than ever a phantasmagoric unreality, and I gave it no more than a passing thought and did not speak of it to the others. But even as the faint, distorted shadows of slumber often tinge one's waking hours, it may have contributed to the nameless mood in which I found myself, a mood in which I felt the unhuman alienage of our surroundings and the black, fathomless antiquity of the ruins like an almost unbearable oppression. The feeling seemed to be made of a million spectral adumbrations that oozed unseen but palpable from the great, unearthly architecture. That weighed upon me like tomb-born incubi, but were void of form and meaning such as could be comprehended by human thought. I appeared to move, not in the open air, but in the smothering gloom of sealed sepulchral vaults, to choke with the death-fraught atmosphere, with the miasmata of aeon-old corruption. My companions were all eager to explore the ruins, and of course it was impossible for me to even mention the apparently absurd and baseless shadows of my mood. Human beings on other worlds than their own are often subject to nervous and psychic symptoms of this sort, engendered by the unfamiliar forces, the novel radiations of their environment. But, as we approached the buildings in our preliminary tour of examination, I lagged behind the others, seized by a paralyzing panic that left me unable to move or breathe for a few moments. A dark, freezing clamminess seemed to pervade my brain and muscles and suspend their inmost working. Then it lifted, and I was free to go on and follow the others. Strangely as it seemed, the two Martians refused to accompany us. Stolid and taciturn, they gave no explicit reason, but evidently nothing would induce them to enter Yoh-Vombis. Whether or not they were afraid of the ruins, we were unable to determine. Their enigmatic faces, with the small oblique eyes and huge flaring nostrils, betrayed neither fear nor any other emotion intelligible to man. In reply to our questions, they merely said that no Ihai had set foot among the ruins for ages. Apparently there was some mysterious taboo in connection with the place. For equipment in that preliminary tour, we took along only a crowbar and 2 picks. Our other tools, and some cartridges of high explosives, we left at our camp to be used later if necessary, after we had surveyed the ground. 1 or 2 of us owned automatics, but these also were left behind, for it seemed absurd to imagine that any form of life would be encountered among the ruins. Octave was visibly excited as we began our inspection and maintained a running fire of exclamatory comment. The rest of us were subdued and silent, and I think that my own feeling, in a measure, was shared by many of the others. It was impossible to shake off the somber awe and wonder that fell upon us from those megalithic stones. I have no time to describe the ruins minutely, but must hasten on with my story. There is much that I could not describe anyway, for the main area of the city was destined to remain unexplored. We went on for some distance among the triangular terraced buildings, following the zigzag streets that conformed to this peculiar architecture. Most of the towers were more or less dilapidated, and everywhere we saw the deep erosion wrought by cycles of blowing wind and sand, which in many cases had worn into roundness the sharp angles of the mighty walls. We entered some of the towers through high, narrow doorways, but found utter emptiness within. Whatever they had contained in the way of furnishings must long ago have crumbled into dust, and the dust had been blown away by the searching desert gales. On some of the outer walls there was evidence of carving or lettering, but all of it was so worn down and obliterated by time that we could trace only a few fragmentary outlines, of which we could make nothing. At length we came to a wide thoroughfare, which ended in the wall of a vast terrace, several hundred yards long by perhaps 40 in height, on which the central buildings were grouped like a sort of citadel or acropolis. A flight of broken steps, designed for longer limbs than those of men or even the gangling modern Martians, afforded access to the terrace, which had seemingly been hewn from the plateau itself. Pausing, we decided to defer our investigation of the higher buildings, which, being more exposed than the others, were doubly ruinous and dilapidated, and in all likelihood would offer little for our trouble. Octave had begun to voice his disappointment over our failure to find anything in the nature of artifacts or carvings that would throw light on the history of Yoh-Vombis. Then, a little to the right of the stairway, we perceived an entrance in the main wall, half choked with ancient debris. Behind the heap of detritus, we found the beginning of a downward flight of steps. Darkness poured from the opening like a visible flood, noisome and musty with primordial stagnancies of decay, and we could see nothing below the first steps, which gave the appearance of being suspended over a black gulf. Octave and myself and several others had brought along electric torches in case we should need them in our explorations. It had occurred to us that there might be subterranean vaults or catacombs in Yoh-Vombis, even as in the latter-day cities of Mars, which are often more extensive underground than above, and such vaults would be the likeliest place in which to look for vestiges of the Yohi civilization. Throwing his torch beam into the abyss, Octave began to descend the stairs. His eager voice called us to follow. Again, for an instant, the unknown, irrational panic froze my faculties, and I hesitated while the others pressed forward behind me. Then, as before, the terror passed, and I wondered at myself for being overcome by anything so absurd and unfounded. I followed Octave down the steps, and the others came trooping after me. At the bottom of the high, awkward steps, we found ourselves in a long and roomy vault, like a subterranean hallway. Its floor was deep with siftings of immemorial dust, and in places there were heaps of a coarse grey powder, such as might be left by the decomposition of certain fungi that grow in the Martian catacombs under the canals. Such fungi at one time might conceivably have existed in Yoh-Vombis, but owing to the prolonged and excessive dehydration, They must have died out long ago. Nothing, surely not even a fungus, could have lived in those arid vaults for many aeons past. The air was singularly heavy, as if the lees of an ancient atmosphere, less tenuous than that of Mars today, had settled down and remained in that stagnant darkness. It was harder to breathe than the outer air. It was filled with unknown effluvia, and the light dust arose before us at every step, diffusing a faintness of bygone corruption, like the dust of powdered mummies. At the end of the vault, before a straight and lofty doorway, our torches revealed an immense shallow urn or pan, supported on short cube-shaped legs, and wrought from a dull, blackish-green material which suggested some bizarre alloy of metal and porcelain. The thing was about 4 feet across, with a thick rim adorned by writhing, indecipherable figures deeply etched as if by acid. In the bottom of the bowl we perceived a deposit of dark and cinder-like fragments, which gave off a slight but disagreeable pungence, like the phantom of some more powerful odor. Octave, bending over the rim, began to cough and sneeze as he inhaled it. That stuff, whatever it was, must have been a pretty strong fumigant, he observed. The people of Yoh-Vombis may have used it to disinfect the vaults. The doorway beyond the shallow urn admitted us to a larger chamber, whose floor was comparatively free of dust. We found that the dark stone beneath our feet was marked off in multiform geometric patterns, traced with ochreous ore, amid which, as in Egyptian cartouches, hieroglyphics and highly formalized drawings were enclosed. We could make little from most of them, but the figures in many were doubtless designed to represent the Yoh-His themselves. Like the Ahais, they were tall and angular, with great bellows-like chests, and they were depicted as possessing a supplementary third arm, which issued from the bosom, a characteristic which, in vestigial form, sometimes occurs among the Ahais. The ears and nostrils, as far as we could judge, were not so huge and flaring as those of the modern Martians. All of these Yoh-His were represented as being nude, but in one of the cartouches, done in a far hastier style than the others, we perceived 2 figures whose high, conical craniums were wrapped in what seemed to be a sort of turban which they were about to remove or adjust. The artist seemed to have laid a peculiar emphasis on the odd gesture with which the sinuous 4-jointed fingers were plucking at these headdresses, and the whole posture was unexplainably contorted. From the second vault passages ramified in all directions, leading to a veritable warren of catacombs. Here, enormous pot-bellied urns of the same material as the fumigating pan, but taller than a man's head and fitted with angular-handled stoppers, were ranged in solemn rows along the walls, leaving scant room for 2 of us to walk abreast. When we succeeded in removing one of the huge stoppers, we saw that the jar was filed to the rim with ashes and charred fragments of bone. Doubtless, as is still the Martian custom, the Yoh-His had stored the cremated remains of whole families in single urns. Even Octave became silent as we went on, and a sort of meditative awe seemed to replace his former excitement. We others, I think, were utterly weighed down to a man by the solid gloom of a concept defying antiquity, into which it seemed that we were going further and further at every step. The shadows fluttered before us, like the monstrous and misshapen wings of phantom bats. There was nothing anywhere but the atom-like dust of ages and the jars that held the ashes of a long-extinct people. But, clinging to the high roof in one of the further vaults, I saw a dark and corrugated patch of circular form, like a withered fungus. It was impossible to reach the thing, and we went on, after peering at it with many futile conjectures. Oddly enough, I failed to remember at that moment the crumpled, shadowy object I had seen or dreamt the night before. I have no idea how far we had gone when we came to the last vault, but it seemed that we had been wandering for ages in that forgotten underworld. The air was growing fouler and more irrespirable, with a thick, sodden quality, as if from a sediment of material rottenness, and we had about decided to turn back. Then, without warning, At the end of a long, urn-lined catacomb, we found ourselves confronted by a blank wall. Here we came upon one of the strangest and most mystifying of our discoveries, a mummified and incredibly desiccated figure standing erect against the wall. It was more than 7 feet in height, of a brown, bituminous color, and was wholly nude except for a sort of black cowl that covered the upper head and drooped down at the sides in wrinkled folds. From the 3 arms and general contour, it was plainly one of the ancient Yohis, perhaps the sole member of this race whose body had remained intact. We all felt an inexpressible thrill at the sheer age of this shriveled thing, which, in the dry air of the vault, had endured through all the historic and geologic vicissitudes of the planet, to provide a visible link with lost cycles. Then, as we peered closer with our torches, we saw why the mummy had maintained an upright position. At ankles, knees, waist, shoulders and neck, it was shackled to the wall by heavy metal bands, so deeply eaten and embrowned with a sort of rust that we had failed to distinguish them at first sight in the shadow. The strange cowl on the head, when closely studied, continued to baffle us. It was covered with a fine mold-like pile, unclean and dusty as ancient cobwebs. Something about it, I know not what, was abhorrent and revolting. "By Jove, this is a real find," ejaculated Octave as he thrust his torch into the mummified face, where shadows moved like living things in the pit-deep hollows of the eyes, and the huge triple nostrils and wide ears that flared upward beneath the cowl. Still lifting the torch, he put out his free hand and touched the body very lightly. Tentative as the touch had been, the lower part of the barrel-like torso, the legs, the hands and forearms all seemed to dissolve into powder, leaving the head and upper body and arms still hanging in their metal fetters. The progress of decay had been queerly unequal, for the remnant portions gave no sign of disintegration. Octave cried out in dismay, and then began to cough and sneeze, as the cloud of brown powder, floating with airy lightness, enveloped him. We others all stepped back to avoid the powder. Then, above the spreading cloud, I saw an unbelievable thing. The black cowl on the mummy's head began to curl and twitch upward at the corners. It writhed with a verminous motion. It fell from the withered cranium, seeming to fold and unfold convulsively in mid-air as it fell. Then it dropped on the bare head of Octave, who, in his disconcertment at the crumbling of the mummy, had remained standing close to the wall. At that instant, in a start of profound terror, I remembered the thing that had inched itself from the shadows of Yoh-Vombis, in the light of the twin moons, and had drawn back like a figment of slumber at my first waking movement. Cleaving closely as a tightened cloth, the thing enfolded Octave's hair and brow and eyes, and he shrieked wildly, with incoherent pleas for help, and tore with frantic fingers at the cowl, but failed to loosen it. Then his cries began to mount in a mad crescendo of agony, as if beneath some instrument of infernal torture, and he danced and capered blindly about the vault, eluding us with strange celerity, as we all sprang forward in an effort to reach him and release him from his weird encumbrance. The whole happening was mysterious as a nightmare, but the thing that had fallen on his head was plainly some unclassified form of Martian life, which, contrary to all the known laws of science, had survived in those primordial catacombs. We must rescue him from its clutches if we could. We tried to close in on the frenzied figure of our chief, which, in the far from roomy space between the last urns and the wall, should have been an easy matter. But, darting away, in a manner doubly incomprehensible because of his blindfolded condition, he circled about us and ran past, to disappear among the urns toward the outer labyrinth of intersecting catacombs. "My God, what has happened to him?" cried Harper. "The man acts as if he were possessed." There was obviously no time for a discussion of the enigma, and we all followed Octave as speedily as our astonishment would permit. We had lost sight of him in the darkness, and when we came to the first division of the vaults, We were doubtful as to which passage he had taken, till we heard a shrill scream several times repeated. In a catacomb on the extreme left. There was a weird, unearthly quality in those screams, which may have been due to the long stagnant air or the peculiar acoustics of the ramifying caverns, but somehow I could not imagine them as issuing from human lips, at least not from those of a living man. They seemed to contain a soulless, mechanical agony, as if they had been wrung from a devil-driven corpse. Thrusting our torches before us into the lurching, fleeing shadows, we raced along between rows of mighty urns. The screaming had died away in sepulchral silence, but far off we heard the light and muffled thud of running feet. We followed in headlong pursuit, but, gasping painfully in the vitiated miasmal air, we were soon compelled to slacken our pace without coming in sight of Octave. Very faintly, and further away than ever, like the tomb-swallowed steps of a phantom, we heard his vanishing footfalls. Then they ceased, and we heard nothing except our own convulsive breathing and the blood that throbbed in our temple veins like steadily beaten drums of alarm. We went on, dividing our party into 3 contingents when we came to a triple branching of the caverns. Harper and Halgren and myself took the middle passage, and after we had gone on for an endless interval without finding any trace of Octave, and had threaded our way through recesses piled to the roof with colossal urns that must have held the ashes of 100 generations, we came out in the huge chamber with the geometric floor designs. Here, very shortly, we were joined by the others, who had likewise failed to locate our missing leader. It would be useless to detail our renewed and hour-long search of the myriad vaults, many of which we had not hitherto explored. All were empty, as far as any sign of life was concerned. I remember passing once more through the vault in which I had seen the dark, rounded patch on the ceiling, and noting with a shudder that the patch was gone. It was a miracle that we did not lose ourselves in that underworld maze, but at last we came back to the final catacomb, in which we had found the shackled mummy. We heard a measured and recurrent clangor as we neared the place, a most alarming and mystifying sound under the circumstances. It was like the hammering of ghouls on some forgotten mausoleum. When we drew nearer, the beams of our torches revealed a sight that was no less unexplainable than unexpected. A human figure, with its back toward us, and the head concealed by a swollen black object that had the size and form of a sofa cushion, was standing near the remains of the mummy and was striking at the wall with a pointed metal bar. How long Octave had been there, and where he had found the bar, we could not know. But the blank wall had crumbled away beneath his furious blows, leaving on the floor a pile of cement-like fragments, and a small, narrow door of the same ambiguous material as the cinerary urns and the fumigating pan had been laid bare. Amazed, uncertain, inexpressibly bewildered, we were all incapable of action or volition at that moment. The whole business was too fantastic and too horrifying, and it was plain that Octave had been overcome by some sort of madness. I, for one, felt the violent upsurge of sudden nausea when I had identified the loathsomely bloated thing that clung to Octave's head and drooped in obscene tumescence on his neck. I did not dare to surmise the causation of its bloating. Before any of us could recover our faculties, Octave flung aside the metal bar and began to fumble for something in the wall. It must have been a hidden spring, though how he could have known its location or existence is beyond all legitimate conjecture. With a dull, hideous grating, the uncovered door swung inward, thick and ponderous as a mausolean slab, leaving an aperture from which the nether midnight seemed to well like a flood of aeon-buried foulness. Somehow, at that instant, our electric torches appeared to flicker and grow dim, and we all breathed a suffocating foetor, like a draught from inner worlds of immemorial putrescence. Octave had turned toward us now, and he stood in an idle posture before the open door, like one who has finished some ordained task. I was the first of our party to throw off the paralyzing spell, and pulling out a clasp knife, the only semblance of a weapon which I carried, I ran over to him. He moved back, but not quickly enough to evade me, when I stabbed with the 4-inch blade at the black turgescent mass that enveloped his whole upper head and hung down upon his eyes. What the thing was, I should prefer not to imagine, if it were possible to imagine. It was formless as a great slug, with neither head nor tail nor apparent organs, an unclean, puffy, leathery thing, covered with that fine, mould-like fur of which I have spoken. The knife tore into it, as if through rotten parchment, making a long gash, and the horror appeared to collapse like a broken bladder. Out of it there gushed a sickening torrent of human blood, mingled with dark, filiated masses that may have been half-dissolved hair, and floating gelatinous lumps like molten bone, and shreds of a curdy white substance. At the same time, Octave began to stagger, and went down at full length on the floor. Disturbed by his fall, the mummy dust androse about him in a curling cloud, beneath which he lay mortally still. Conquering my revulsion, and choking with the dust, I bent over him and tore the flaccid, oozing horror from his head. It came with unexpected ease, as if I had removed a limp rag, but I wished to God that I had let it remain. Beneath there was no longer a human cranium, for all had been eaten away, even to the eyebrows, and the half-devoured brain was laid bare as I lifted the cowl-like object. I dropped the unnameable thing from fingers that had grown suddenly nerveless, and it turned over as it fell, revealing on the nether side many rows of pinkish suckers, arranged in circles about a pallid disc that was covered with nerve-like filaments, suggesting a sort of plexus. My companions had pressed forward behind me, but for an appreciable interval no one spoke. "How long do you suppose he has been dead?" It was Hallgren who whispered the awful question, which we had all been asking ourselves. Apparently no one felt able or willing to answer it, and we could only stare in horrible, timeless fascination at Octave. At length I made an effort to avert my gaze, and turning at random, I saw the remnants of the shackled mummy, and noted for the first time, with mechanical, unreal horror, the half-eaten condition of the withered head. From this, my gaze was diverted to the newly opened door at one side, without perceiving for a moment what had drawn my attention. Then, startled, I beheld beneath my torch, far down beyond the door, as if in some nether pit, a seething, multitudinous, worm-like movement of crawling shadows. They seemed to boil up in the darkness, and then, over the broad threshold of the vault, there poured the verminous vanguard of a countless army. Things that were kindred to the monstrous, diabolic leech I had torn from Octave's eaten head. Some were thin and flat, like writhing, doubling discs of cloth or leather, and others were more or less poddy, and crawled with glutted slowness. What they had found to feed on in the sealed, eternal midnight I do not know, and I pray that I never shall know. I sprang back and away from them, electrified with terror, sick with loathing, and the black army inched itself unendingly with nightmare swiftness from the unsealed abyss, like the nauseous vomit of horror-sated hells. As it poured toward us, burying Octave's body from sight in a writhing wave, I saw a stir of life from the seemingly dead thing I had cast aside, and saw the loathly struggle which it made to right itself and join the others. But neither I nor my companions could endure to look longer. We turned and ran between the mighty rows of urns, with the slithering mass of demon leeches close upon us, and scattered in blind panic when we came to the first division of the vaults. Heedless of each other, or of anything but the urgency of flight, we plunged into the ramifying passages at random. Behind me, I heard someone stumble and go down, with a curse that mounted to an insane shrieking, but I knew that if I halted and went back, it would be only to invite the same baleful doom that had overtaken the hindmost of our party. Still clutching the electric torch and my open clasp knife, I ran along a minor passage which, I seem to remember, would conduct with more or less directness upon the large outer vault with the painted floor. Here I found myself alone. The others had kept to the main catacombs, and I heard far off a muffled babble of mad cries, as if several of them had been seized by their pursuers. It seemed that I must have been mistaken about the direction of the passage, for it turned and twisted in an unfamiliar manner, with many intersections, and I soon found that I was lost in the black labyrinth, where the dust had lain unstirred by living feet for inestimable generations. The cinerary warren had grown still once more, and I heard my own frenzied panting, loud and stertorous as that of a titan in the dead silence. Suddenly, as I went on, my torch disclosed a human figure coming toward me in the gloom. Before I could master my startlement, the figure had passed me with long, machine-like strides, as if returning to the inner vaults. I think it was Harper, since the height and build were about right for him, but I am not altogether sure, for the eyes and upper head were muffled by a dark, inflated cowl, and the pale lips were locked as if in a silence of titanic torture, or death. Whoever he was, he had dropped his torch, and he was running blindfold, in utter darkness, beneath the impulsion of that unearthly vampirism, to seek the very fountainhead of the unloosed horror. I knew that he was beyond human help, and I did not even dream of trying to stop him. Trembling violently, I resumed my flight, and was passed by two more of our party, stalking by with mechanical swiftness and sureness, and cowled with those satanic leeches. The others must have returned by way of the main passages, for I did not meet them, and I was never to see them again. The remainder of my flight is a blur of pandemonian terror. Once more, after thinking that I was near the outer cavern, I found myself astray, and fled through a ranged eternity of monstrous urns, in vaults that must have extended for an unknown distance beyond our explorations. It seemed that I had gone on for years, and my lungs were choking with the aeon dead air, and my legs were ready to crumble beneath me, when I saw far off a tiny point of blessed daylight. I ran toward it, with all the terrors of the alien darkness crowding behind me, and accursed shadows flittering before, and saw that the vault ended in a low, ruinous entrance, littered by rubble on which there fell an arc of thin sunshine. It was another entrance than the one by which we had penetrated this lethal underworld. I was within a dozen feet of the opening when, without sound or other intimation, something dropped upon my head from the roof above. Blinding me instantly and closing upon me like a tautened net, my brow and scalp, at the same time, were shot through with a million needle-like pangs. A manifold, ever-growing agony that seemed to pierce the very bone and converge from all sides upon my inmost brain. The terror and suffering of that moment were worse than aught which the hells of earthly madness or delirium could ever contain. I felt the foul, vampiric clutch of an atrocious death, and of more than death. I believe that I dropped the torch, but the fingers of my right hand had still retained the open knife. Instinctively, since I was hardly capable of conscious volition, I raised the knife and slashed blindly, again and again, many times, at the thing that had fastened its deadly folds upon me. The blade must have gone through and through the clinging monstrosity, to gash my own flesh in a score of places, but I did not feel the pain of those wounds in the million-throbbing torment that possessed me. At last I saw light, and saw that a black strip, loosened from above my eyes and dripping with my own blood, was hanging down my cheek. It writhed a little, even as it hung, and I ripped it away, and ripped the other remnants of the thing, tatter by oozing, bloody latter, from off my brow and head. Then I staggered toward the entrance, and the one light turned to a far-receding, dancing flame before me as I lurched and fell outside the cavern, a flame that fled like the last star of creation above the yawning, sliding chaos and oblivion into which I descended. I am told that my unconsciousness was of brief duration. I came to myself with the cryptic faces of the two Martian guides bending over me. My head was full of lancinating pains, and half-remembered terrors closed upon my mind like the shadows of mustering harpies. I rolled over and looked back toward the cavern mouth, from which the Martians, after finding me, had seemingly dragged me for some little distance. The mouth was under the terraced angle of an outer building, and within sight of our camp. I stared at the black opening with hideous fascination, and descried a shadowy stirring in the gloom. The writhing, verminous movement of things that pressed forward from the darkness, but did not emerge into the light. Doubtless they could not endure the sun, those creatures of ultramundane night and cycle-sealed corruption. It was then that the ultimate horror, the beginning madness, came upon me. Amid my crawling revulsion, my nausea-prompted desire to flee from that seething cavern mouth, there rose an abhorrently conflicting impulse to return, to thread my backward way through all the catacombs as the others had done, to go down where never men save they, the inconceivably doomed and accursed, had ever gone, to seek beneath that damnable compulsion a nether world that human thought can never picture. There was a black light, a soundless calling, in the vaults of my brain, the implanted summons of the thing, like a permeating and sorcerous poison. It lured me to the subterranean door that was walled up by the dying people of Yoh-Vombis to immure those hellish and immortal leeches, those dark parasites that engraft their own abominable life on the half-eaten brains of the dead. It called me to the depths beyond, where dwell the noisome, necromantic ones, of whom the leeches, with all their powers of vampirism and diabolism, are but the merest minions. It was only the two Haines who prevented me from going back. I struggled. I fought them insanely as they strove to retard me with their spongy arms. But I must have been pretty thoroughly exhausted from all the superhuman adventures of the day, and I went down once more, after a little, into fathomless nothingness, from which I floated out at long intervals, to realize that I was being carried across the desert toward Ignar. Well, that is all my story. I have tried to tell it fully and coherently, at a cost that would be unimaginable to the sane, to tell it before the madness falls upon me again, as it will very soon, as it is doing now. Yes, I have told my story, and you have written it all out, haven't you? Now I must go back to Yoh-Vombis, back across the desert and down through all the catacombs to the vaster vaults beneath. Something is in my brain that commands me and will direct me. I tell you, I must go. End of the Vaults of Yoh-Vombis by Clark Ashton Smith. The Dweller in the Gulf by Clark Ashton Smith. Wonder Stories Quarterly, 1933. Only when we begin to explore other worlds will we fully experience the innumerable forms of life and the mysteries of the living world. No one, perhaps, is as competent to write about these mysteries as Clark Ashton Smith. With his scientific knowledge and imagination, rivaling that of Poe, he creates strange and bizarre worlds. He takes on the challenge of depicting Mars and paints a series of events that are perfectly plausible. He delves into a world of sensation that we may experience only in dreams, yet one that, given new conditions, could become part of everyday existence. And then, if you like, there is a little moral to this story that our astute readers might discover. It is a moral that holds great meaning in our present-day earthly troubles. Swelling and towering swiftly, like a genie loosed from one of Solomon's bottles, the cloud rose on the planet's rim. A rusty and colossal column it strode above the dead plain, through a sky that was dark as the brine of desert seas that have ebbed down to desert pools. "Looks like a blithering sandstorm," commented Maspic. "It can't very well be anything else," agreed Bellman rather curtly. "Any other kind of storm is unheard of in these regions. It's the sort of hell-twister that the Haines call the Zorth, and it's coming our way too. I move that we start looking for shelter. I've been caught in the Zorth before, and I don't recommend a lungful of that ferruginous dust." "There's a cave in the old river bank, to the right," said Chivers, the third member of the party, who had been searching the desert with restless falcon-like eyes. The trio of Earthmen, hard-bitten adventurers who disdained the services of Martian guides, had started 5 days before from the outpost of Vulthoom into the uninhabited region called the Shore. Here, in the beds of great rivers that had not flowed for cycles, it was rumored that the pale, platinum-like gold of Mars could be found lying in heaps, like so much salt. If fortune were propitious, their years of somewhat unwilling exile on the Red Planet would soon be at an end. They had been warned against the Shore and had heard some queer tales in Vulthoom regarding the reasons why former prospectors had not returned. But danger, no matter how dire or exotic, was merely a part of their daily routine. With a fair chance of unlimited gold at the journey's end, they would have gone down through Hinnom. Their food supplies and water barrels were carried on the backs of 3 of those curious mammals called Vulthoom, which, with their elongated legs and necks and horny plated bodies, might seemingly have been some fabulous combination of llama and saurian. These animals, though extravagantly ugly, were tame and obedient, and were well adapted to desert travel, being able to go without water for months at a time. For the past 2 days they had followed the mile-wide course of a nameless ancient river, winding among hills that had dwindled to mere hummocks through eons of exfoliation. They had found nothing but worn boulders, pebbles, and fine rusty sand. Heretofore the sky had been silent and stirless, and nothing moved on the river bottom, whose stones were bare even of dead lichen. The malignant column of the Zorth, twisting and swelling toward them, was the first sign of animation they had discerned in that lifeless land. Prodding their Vulthoom with the iron-pointed goads which alone could elicit any increase of speed from these sluggish monsters, the Earthmen started off toward the cavern mouth described by Chivers. It was perhaps 1/3 of a mile distant, and was high up in the shelving shore. The Zorth had blotted out the sun ere they reached the bottom of the ancient slope, and they moved through a sinister twilight that was colored like dried blood. The Vulthoom, protesting with unearthly bellows, began to climb the beach, which was marked off in a series of more or less regular steps that indicated the slow recession of its olden waters. The column of sand, rising and whirling formidably, had reached the opposite bank when they came to the cavern. This cavern was in the face of a low cliff of iron-veined rock. The entrance had crumbled down in heaps of ferro-oxide and dark basaltic dust, but was large enough to admit with ease the Earthmen and their laden beasts of burden. Darkness, heavy as if with a weaving of black webs, clogged the interior. They could form no idea of the cave's dimensions till Bellman got out an electric torch from his bale of belongings and turned its prying beam into the shadows. The torch served merely to reveal the beginnings of a chamber of indeterminate size that ran backward into night, widening gradually, with a floor that was worn smooth as if by vanished waters. The opening had grown dark with the onset of the Zorth. A weird moaning as of baffled demons filled the ears of the explorers, and particles of atom-like sand were blown in upon them, stinging their hands and faces like powdered adamant. "The storm will last for half an hour at least," said Bellman. "Shall we go on into the cave? Probably we won't find anything of much interest or value, but the exploration will serve to kill time, and we might happen on a few violet rubies or amber-yellow sapphires, such as are sometimes discovered in these desert caverns. You two had better bring along your torches also, and flash them on the walls and ground as we go." His companions thought the suggestion worth following. The Vulthoom, wholly insensible to the blowing sand in their scaly mail, were left behind near the entrance. Chivers, Bellman and Maspic, with their torch beams tearing a clotted gloom that had perhaps never known the intrusion of light in all its former cycles, went on into the widening cave. The place was bare, with the death-like emptiness of some long-deserted catacomb. Its rusted floor and walls returned no gleam or sparkle to the playing lights. It sloped downward at an easy gradient, and the sides were watermarked at a height of 6 or 7 feet. No doubt it had been in earlier aeons the channel of an underground offshoot from the river. It had been swept clean of all detritus, and was like the interior of some cyclopean conduit that might give upon a sub-Martian Erebus. None of the three adventurers was overly imaginative or prone to nervousness, but all were beset by certain odd impressions. Behind the arras of cryptic silence, time and again they seemed to hear a faint whisper, like the sigh of sunken seas far down at some hemispheric depth. The air was tinged with a slight and doubtful dankness, and they felt the stirring of an almost imperceptible draught upon their faces. Oddest of all was the hint of a nameless odor, reminding them both of animal dens and the peculiar smell of Martian dwellings. "Do you suppose we'll encounter any kind of life?" said Maspic, sniffing the air dubiously. "Not likely." Bellman dismissed the query with his usual curtness. "Even the wild Vortlups avoid the shore." "But there's certainly a touch of dampness in the air," persisted Maspic. "That means water, somewhere. And if there is water, there may be life also, perhaps of a dangerous kind." "We've got our revolvers," said Bellman, "but I doubt if we'll need them, as long as we don't meet any rival gold hunters from the Earth," he added cynically. "Listen." The semi-whisper came from Chivers. "Do you fellows hear anything?" All three had paused. Somewhere in the gloom ahead, they heard a prolonged equivocal noise that baffled the ear with incongruous elements. It was a sharp rustling and rattling as of metal dragged over rock, and also it was somehow like the smacking of myriad wet, enormous mouths. Anon it receded and died out at a level that was seemingly far below. "That's queer." Bellman seemed to make a reluctant admission. "What is it?" queried Chivers. "One of the millipedal underground monsters 1/2 mile long that the Martians tell about." "You've been hearing too many native fairy tales," reproved Bellman. "No terrestrial has ever seen anything of that kind. Many deep-lying caverns on Mars have been thoroughly explored, but those in desert regions such as the shore were devoid of life. I can't imagine what could have made that noise, but in the interests of science, I'd like to go on and find out." "I'm beginning to feel creepy," said Maspic, "but I'm game if you others are." Without further argument or comment, the three continued their advance into the cave. They had been walking at a fair gait for 15 minutes, and were now at least 1/2 mile from the entrance. The floor was steepening as if it had been the bed of a torrent. Also, the conformation of the walls had changed. On either hand there were high shelves of metallic stone and columnated recesses, which the flashed rays of the torches could not always fathom. The air had grown heavier, the dampness unmistakable. There was a breath of stagnant ancient waters. That other smell, as of wild beasts and eye-high dwellings, also tainted the gloom with its clinging foetor. Bellman was leading the way. Suddenly his torch revealed the verge of a precipice, where the olden channel ended sheerly, and the shelves and walls pitched away on each side into incalculable space. Going to the very edge, he dipped his pencil of light adown the abyss, disclosing only the vertical cliff that fell at his feet into darkness with no apparent bottom. The beam also failed to reach the further shore of the gulf, which might have been many leagues in extent. "Looks as if we had found the original jumping-off place," observed Chivers. Looking about, he secured a loose lump of rock the size of a small boulder, which he hurled as far out as he could into the abysm. The Earthman listened for the sound of its fall, but several minutes went by, and there was no echo from the black profound. Bellman started to examine the broken-off ledges on either side of the channel's terminus. To the right he discerned a downward-sloping shelf that skirted the abyss, running for an uncertain distance. Its beginning was little higher than the channel fed, and was readily accessible by means of a stair-like formation. The shelf was 2 yards wide, and its gentle inclination. Its remarkable evenness and regularity conveyed the idea of an ancient road hewn in the face of the cliff. It was overhung by the wall, as if by the sharply sundered half of a high arcade. "There's our road to Hades," said Bellman, "and the downgrade is easy enough at that." "What's the use of going further?" said Maspic. "I, for one, have had enough darkness already, and if we were to find anything by going on, it would be valueless or unpleasant." Bellman hesitated. "Maybe you're right, but I'd like to follow that ledge far enough to get some idea of the magnitude of the gulf. You and Chivers can wait here if you're afraid." Chivers and Maspic apparently were unwilling to avow whatever trepidation they might have felt. They followed Bellman along the shelf, hugging the inner wall. Bellman, however, strode carelessly on the verge, often flashing his torch into the vastitude that engulfed its feeble beam. More and more, through its uniform breadth, inclination and smoothness, and the demi-arch of cliff above, the shelf impressed the Earthmen as being an artificial road. But who could have made and used it? In what forgotten ages, and for what enigmatic purpose had it been designed? The imagination of the terrestrials failed before the stupendous gulfs of Martian antiquity that yawned in such tenebrous queries. Bellman thought that the wall curved inward upon itself by slow degrees. No doubt they would round the entire abyss in time by following the road. Perhaps it wound in a slow, tremendous spiral, ever downward, about and about, to the very bowels of Mars. He and the others were awed into lengthening intervals of silence. They were horribly startled when, as they went on, they heard in the depths beneath the same peculiar long-drawn sound, or combination of sounds which they had heard in the outer cavern. It suggested other images now. The rustling was a file-like scraping. The soft, methodical, myriad smacking was vaguely similar to the noise made by some enormous creature that withdraws its feet from a quagmire. The sound was inexplicable, terrifying. Part of its terror lay in an implication of remoteness, which appeared to signalize the enormity of its cause and to emphasize the profundity of the abysm. Heard in that planetary pit, beneath a lifeless desert, it astonished and shocked. Even Bellman, intrepid heretofore, began to succumb to the formless horror that rose up like an emanation from the night. The noise grew fainter and ceased at length, giving somehow the idea that its maker had gone directly down on the perpendicular wall into nether reaches of the gulf. "Shall we go back?" inquired Chivers. "We might as well," assented Bellman without demur. It would take all eternity to explore this place anyway. They started to retrace their way along the ledge. All three, with that extra tactile sense which warns of the approach of hidden danger, were now troubled and alert. Though the gulf had grown silent once more with that withdrawal of the strange noise, they somehow felt that they were not alone. Whence the peril would come, or in what shape, they could not surmise, but they felt an alarm that was almost panic. Tacitly, none of them mentioned it, nor did they discuss the eerie mystery on which they had stumbled in a manner so fortuitous. Maspic was a little ahead of the others now. They had covered at least half of the distance to the old cavern channel, when his torch, playing for 20 feet ahead on the path, illumined an array of whitish figures. 3 abreast, that blocked the way. The flashlights of Bellman and Chivers, coming close behind, brought out with hideous clearness the vanward limbs and faces of the throng, but could not determine its number. The creatures, who stood perfectly motionless and silent, as if awaiting the Earthmen, were generically similar to the Ihais or Martian natives. They seemed, however, to represent an extremely degraded and aberrant type, and the fungus-like pallor of their bodies denoted many ages of underground life. They were smaller, too, than full-grown Ihais, being, on the average, about 5 feet tall. They possessed the enormous open nostrils, the flaring ears, the barreled chests and lanky limbs of the Martians, but all of them were eyeless. In the faces of some there were faint rudimentary slits where the eyes should have been. In the faces of others there were deep and empty orbits that suggested a removal of the eyeballs. "Lord," "What a ghastly crew," cried Maspic. "Where do they come from? And what do they want?" "Can't imagine," said Bellman. "But our situation is somewhat ticklish, unless they are friendly. They must have been hiding on the shelves in the cavern above when we entered." Stepping boldly forward, ahead of Maspic, he addressed the creatures in the guttural Ahai tongue, many of whose vocables are scarcely to be articulated by an earthman. Some of the people stirred uneasily and emitted shrill, cheeping sounds that bore little likeness to the Martian language. It was plain that they could not understand Bellman. Sign language, by reason of their blindness, would have been equally useless. Bellman drew his revolver, enjoining the others to follow suit. "We've got to get through them somehow," he said, "and if they won't let us pass without interference—" The click of a cocked hammer served to finish the sentence. As if the metallic sound had been an awaited signal, the press of blind white beings sprang into sudden motion and surged forward upon the terrestrials. It was like the onset of automatons, an irresistible striding of machines, concerted and methodical, beneath the direction of a hidden power. Into the depth. Bellman pulled his trigger, once, twice, thrice, at a point-blank range. It was impossible to miss, but the bullets were futile, as pebbles flung at the spate of an onrushing torrent. The eyeless beings did not waver, though two of them began to bleed the yellowish-red fluid that serves the Martians for blood. The foremost of them, unwounded and moving with diabolical sureness, caught Bellman's arm with long, four-jointed fingers and jerked the revolver from his grasp before he could press the trigger again. Curiously enough, the creature did not try to deprive him of his torch, which he now carried in his left hand, and he saw the steely flash of the Colt as it hurtled down into darkness and space from the hand of the Martian. Then the fungus-white bodies, milling horribly on the narrow road, were all about him, pressing so closely that there was no room for effectual resistance. Chivers and Maspic, after firing a few shots, were also deprived of their weapons, but through an uncanny discrimination were permitted to retain their flashlights. The entire episode had been a matter of moments. There was only a brief slackening of the onward motion of the throng, two of whose members had been shot down by Chivers and Maspic and then hurled expeditiously into the gulf by their fellows. The foremost ranks, opening deftly, included the Earthmen and forced them to turn backward. Then, tightly caught in a moving vice of bodies, they were borne resistlessly along. Handicapped by the fear of dropping their torches, they could do nothing against the nightmare torrent. Rushing with dreadful strides on a path that led ever deeper into the abyss, and able to see only the lit backs and members of the creatures before them, they became a part of that eyeless and cryptic army. Behind them, there seemed to be scores of the Martians, driving them on implacably. After a while, their plight began to paralyze their faculties. It seemed that they moved no longer with human steps, but with the swift and automatic stalking of the clammy things that pressed about them. Thought, volition, even terror, were numbed by the unearthly rhythm of those abyssward beating feet. Constrained by this, and by a sense of utter unreality, they spoke only at long intervals, and then in monosyllables that appeared to have lost all proper meaning, like the speech of machines. The blind people were wholly silent. There was no sound, except that of a myriad eternal padding on the stone. On they went, through ebon hours that belonged to no diurnal period. Slowly, tortuously, the road curved inward, as if it were coiled about the interior of a blind and cosmic babel. The Earthmen felt that they must have circled the abyss many times in that terrific spiral, but the distance they had gone, and the actual extent of the stupefying gulf, were inconceivable. Except for their torches, the night was absolute, unchangeable. It was older than the sun. It had brooded there through all past eons. It accumulated above them like a monstrous burden. It yawned frightfully beneath. From it, the strengthening stench of stagnant waters rose. But still there was no sound, other than the soft and measured thud of marching feet that descended into a bottomless Abaddon. Somewhere, as if after the lapse of nocturnal ages, the pitward rushing had ceased. Bellman, Chivers, and Maspic felt the pressure of crowded bodies relax, felt that they were standing still, while their brains continued to beat the unhuman measure of that terrible descent. Reason and horror returned to them slowly. Bellman lifted his flashlight, and the circling ray recovered the throng of Martians, many of whom were dispersing in a huge cavern where the gulf-circling road had now ended. Others of the beings remained, however, as if to keep guard over the Earthmen. They quivered alertly at Bellman's movements, as if aware of them through an unknown sense. Close at hand, on the right, the level floor ended abruptly, and stepping to the verge, Bellman saw that the cavern was an open chamber in the perpendicular wall. Far, far below in the blackness, a phosphorescent glimmer played to and fro like Noctiluca on an underworld ocean. A slow, fetid wind blew upon him, and he heard the weird sighing of waters about the sunken cliffs, waters that had ebbed through untold cycles during the planet's desiccation. He turned giddily away. His companions were examining the cave's interior. It seemed that the place was of artificial origin, for, darting here and there, the torch beams brought out enormous columnations lined with deeply graven bas-reliefs. Who had carved them or when, were problems no less insoluble than the origin of the cliff-hewn road. Their details were obscene as the visions of madness. They shocked the eye like a violent blow, conveying an extra-human evil, a bottomless malignity, in the passing moment of disclosure. The cave was indeed of stupendous extent, running far back in the cliff, and with numerous exits, giving no doubt on further ramifications. The beams of the flashlights half dislodged the flapping shadows of shelved recesses, caught the salience of far walls that climbed and beetled into inaccessible gloom, played on the creatures that went to and fro like monstrous living fungi, gave to a brief visual existence the pale and polyp-like plants that clung noisomely to the nighted stone. The place was overpowering. It oppressed the senses, crushed the brain. The very stone was like an embodiment of darkness, and light and vision were ephemeral intruders in this domain of the blind. Somehow, the Earthmen were weighed down by a conviction that escape was impossible. A strange lethargy claimed them. They did not even discuss their situation, but stood listless and silent. Anon, from the filthy gloom, a number of the Martians reappeared. With the same suggestion of control automatism that had marked all their actions, they gathered about the men once more and urged them into the yawning cavern. Step by step, the three were borne along in that weird and leprous procession. The obscene columns multiplied, the cave deepened before them with endless vistas, like a revelation of foul things that drowse at the nadir of night. Faintly at first, but more strongly as they went on, there came to them an insidious feeling of somnolence, such as might have been caused by mephitical effluvia. They rebelled against it, for the drowsiness was somehow dark and evil. It grew heavier upon them, and then they came to the core of the horror. Between the thick and seemingly topless pillars, the floor ascended in an altar of 7 oblique and pyramidal tiers. On the top, there squatted an image of pale metal, a thing no larger than a hair, but monstrous beyond all imagining. The Martians crowded about the Earthmen. One of them took Bellman by the arm, as if urging him to climb the altar. With the slow steps of a dreamer, he mounted the sloping tiers, and Chivers and Maspic followed. The image resembled nothing they had ever seen on the Red Planet, or elsewhere. It was carven of whitish gold, and it represented a humped animal with a smooth and overhanging carapace, from beneath which its head and members issued in tortoise fashion. The head was venomously flat, triangular, and eyeless. From the drooping corners of the cruelly slitted mouth, 2 long proboscides curved upward, hollow and cup-like at the ends. The thing was furnished with a series of short legs, issuing at uniform intervals from under the carapace, and a curious double tail was coiled and braided beneath its crouching body. The feet were round and had the shape of small inverted goblets. The image of the dweller. Unclean and bestial as a figment of some atavistic madness, the eidolon seemed to drowse on the altar. It troubled the mind with a slow, insidious horror. It assailed the senses with an emanating stupor, an effluence as of primal worlds before the creation of light, where life might teem and raven slothfully in the blind ooze. Dimly the earthmen saw that the altar swarmed with the blind Martians, who were crowding past them about the image. As if in some fantastic ritual of touch, these creatures were fondling the eidolon with their lank fingers, were tracing its loathsome outlines. Upon their brutal faces a narcotic ecstasy was imprinted, compelled like sleepers in some abhorrent dream. Bellman, Chivers, and Maspic followed their example. The thing was cold to the touch and clammy as if it had lain recently in a bed of slime, but it seemed to live, to throb and swell under their fingertips. From it, in heavy, ceaseless waves, a dark vibration surged, an opiate power that clouded the eyes, that poured its baleful slumber into the blood. With senses that swam in a strange darkness, they were vaguely aware of the pressure of thronging bodies that displaced them at the altar summit. Anon, certain of these, recoiling as if satiate with the drug like effluence, bore them along the oblique tiers to the cavern floor. Still retaining their torches in nerveless fingers, they saw that the place teemed with the white people who had gathered for that unholy ceremony. Through blackening blurs of shadow, the men watched them as they seethed up and down on the pyramid like a leprous living frieze. Chivers and Maspic, yielding first to the influence, slid to the floor in utter sopor, but Bellman, more resistant, seemed to fall and drift through a world of lightless dreams. His sensations were anomalous, unfamiliar to the last degree. Everywhere there was a brooding, palpable power for which he could find no visual image, a power that exhaled a miasmal slumber. In those dreams, by insensible graduations, forgetting the last glimmer of his human self, he somehow identified himself with the eyeless people. He lived and moved as they, in profound caverns, on nighted roads. And yet he was something else, an entity without name that ruled over the blind and was worshipped by them. A thing that dwelt in the ancient putrescent waters, in the nether deep, and came forth at intervals to raven unspeakably. In that duality of being he sated himself at blind feasts, and was also devoured. With all this, like a third element of identity, the eidolon was associated but only a tactile sense, and not as an optic memory. There was no light anywhere, and not even the recollection of light. Whether he passed from these obscure nightmares into dreamless slumber, he could not know. His awakening, dark and lethargic, was like a continuation of the dreams at first. Then, opening his sodden lids, he saw the shaft of fight that lay on the floor front his fallen torch. The light poured against something that he could not recognize in his drugged awareness. Yet it troubled him, and a dawning horror touched his faculties into life. By degrees, it came to him that the thing he saw was the half-eaten body of one of the eyeless troglodytes. Some of the members were missing, and the remainder was gnawed even to the curiously articulated bones. Bellman rose unsteadily and looked about with eyes that still held a web-like blurring of shadow. Chivers and Maspic lay beside him in heavy stupor, and along the cavern, and upon the seven-tiered altar, were sprawled the devotees of the somnific image. His other senses began to awake from their lethargy, and he thought that he heard a noise that was somehow familiar, a sharp slithering, together with a measured sucking. The sound withdrew among the massy pillars, beyond the sleeping bodies. A smell as of rotten water tinged the air, and he saw that there were many curious rings of wetness on the stone. such as might be made by the rims of inverted cups. Preserving the order of footprints, they led away from the half-devoured Martian into the shadows of that outer cave which verged upon the abyss, the direction in which the queer noise had passed, sinking now to inaudibility. In Bellman's mind, a mad terror rose and struggled with a spell that still benumbed him. He stooped down above Maspic and Chivers and shook them roughly in turn, till they opened their eyes and began to protest with drowsy murmurs. "Get up, damn you," he admonished them. "If we're ever to escape from this hellhole, now's the time." By dint of many oaths and objurgations, and much muscular effort, he succeeded in getting his companions to their feet. Lurching drunkenly, they followed Bellman among the sprawled Martians, away from the pyramid on which the eidolon of white gold still brooded in malign somnolence above its worshippers. A clouding heaviness hung upon Bellman, but somehow there was a relaxation of the opiate spell. He felt a revival of volition and a great desire to escape from the gulf and from all that dwelt in its darkness. The others, more deeply enslaved by the drowsy power, accepted his leadership and guidance in a numb, brute-like fashion. He felt sure that he could retrace the route by which they had approached the altar. This, it seemed, was also the course that had been taken by the maker of the ring-like marks of fetid wetness. Wandering on amid the repugnantly carven columns for what seemed an enormous distance, they came at last to the sheer verge, that portis of the Black Tartarus, from which they could look down on its ultimate gulf. Far beneath, on those putrefying waters, the phosphorescence ran in widening circles, as if troubled by the plunge of a heavy body. To the very edge, at their feet, the watery rings were imprinted on the rock. They turned away, Bellman, shuddering with half-memories of his blind dreams and the terror of his awakening. Found at the cave's corner the beginning of that upward road which skirted the abyss, the road that would take them back to the lost sun. At his injunction, Maspic and Chivers turned off their flashlights to conserve the batteries. It was doubtful how much longer these would last, and light was their prime necessity. His own torch would serve for the three till it became exhausted. There was no sound or stirring of life from that cave of lightless sleep, where the Martians lay about the narcotizing image. But a fear such as he had never felt in all his adventurings caused Bellman to sicken and turn faint as he listened at its threshold. The gulf, too, was silent, and the circles of phosphor had ceased to widen on the waters. Yet somehow the silence was a thing that clogged the senses, retarded the limbs. It rose up around Bellman like the clutching slime of some nethermost pit, in which he must drown. With dragging effort he began the ascent, hauling, cursing and kicking his companions till they responded like drowsy animals. It was a climb through limbo, an ascent from nadir through darkness that seemed palpable and viscid. On and up they toiled, along the monotonous, imperceptibly winding grade where all measure of distance was lost, and time was meted only by the repetition of eternal steps. The night lowered before Bellman's feeble shaft of light. It closed behind like an all-engulfing sea, relentless and patient, biding its time till the torch should go out. Looking over the verge at intervals, Bellman saw the gradual fading of the phosphorescence in the depths. Fantastic images rose in his mind. It was like the last glimmering of hellfire in some extinct inferno, like the drowning of nebulae in voids beneath the universe. He felt the giddiness of one who looks down upon infinite space. Anon there was only blackness, and he knew by this token the awful distance they had climbed. The minor urges of hunger, thirst, fatigue had been trod under by the fear that impelled him. From Maspic and Chivers, very slowly, the clogging stupor lifted, and they too were conscious of an adumbration of terror, vast as the night itself. The blows and kicks and objurgations of Bellman were no longer needed to drive them on. Evil, ancient, supperous, the night hung about them. It was like the thick and fetid fur of bats, a material thing that choked the lungs, that deadened all the senses. It was silent as the slumber of dead worlds. But out of that silence, after the lapse of apparent years, a twofold and familiar sound arose and overtook the fugitives, the sound of something that slithered over stone far down in the abyss, the sucking noise of a creature that withdrew its feet as if from a quagmire. Inexplicable and arousing mad, incongruous ideas, like a sound heard in delirium, it quickened the Earthmen's terror into sudden frenzy. "God! What is it?" breathed Bellman. He seemed to remember sightless things, abhorrent, palpable shapes of primal night that were no legitimate part of human recollection. His dreams and his nightmare awakening in the cave, the white eidolon, the half-eaten troglodyte of the nether cliffs, the rings of wetness leading toward the gulf. All returned like the figments of a teeming madness, all to assail him on that terrible road midway between the underworld sea and the surface of Mars. His question was answered only by a continuation of the noise. It seemed to grow louder, to ascend the wall beneath. Maspic and Chivers, snapping on their lights, began to run with frantic leaps, and Bellman, losing his last remnant of control, followed suit. It was a race with unknown horror. Above the labored beating of their hearts, the measured thudding of their feet, the men still heard that sinister, unaccountable sound. They seemed to race on through leagues of blackness, and yet the noise drew nearer, climbing below them, as if its maker were a thing that walked on the sheer cliff. Now the sound was appallingly close, and a little ahead. It ceased abruptly. The running lights of Maspic and Chivers, who moved abreast, discovered the crouching thing that filled the 2-yard shelf from side to side. Hardened adventurers though they were, the men would have shrieked aloud with hysteria, or would have hurled themselves from the precipice, if the sight had not induced a kind of catalepsy. It was as if the pale idol of the pyramid, swollen to mammoth proportions and loathsomely alive, had come up from the abyss and was squatting before them. Here, plainly, was the creature that had served as a model for that atrocious image. The humped, enormous carapace, vaguely recalling the armor of the Glyptodon, shone with a luster as of wet white gold. The eyeless head, alert but somnolent, was thrust forward on a neck that arched obscenely. A dozen or more of short legs with goblet-shapen feet protruded slantwise beneath the overhanging shell. The 2 proboscides, yard-long with cupped ends, arose from the corners of the cruelly slitted mouth and waved slowly in air toward the Earthmen. The thing, it seemed, was old as that dying planet, an unknown form of primal life that had dwelt always in the caverned waters. Before it, the faculties of the Earthmen were drugged by an evil stupor, such as they had felt before the Eidolon. They stood with their flashlights playing full on the terror, and they could not move nor cry out when it reared suddenly erect, revealing its ridged belly and the queer double tail that slithered and rustled metallically on the rock. Its numerous feet, beheld in this posture, were hollow and chalice-like, and they oozed with mephitic wetness. No doubt they served for suction pads, enabling it to walk on a perpendicular surface. Inconceivably swift and sure in all its motions, with short strides on its hindmost legs levered by the tail, the monster came forward on the helpless men. Unerringly, the 2 proboscides curved over, and their ends came down on Chivers' eyes as he stood with lifted face. They rested there, covering the entire sockets, for a moment only. Then there was an agonizing scream as the hollow tips were withdrawn, with a sweeping movement lithe and vigorous as the lashing of serpents. Chivers swayed slowly, nodding his head and twisting about in half-narcotized pain. Maspic, standing at his side, saw in a dull and dreamlike manner the gaping orbits from which the eyes were gone. It was the last thing that he ever saw. At that instant, the monster turned from Chivers, and the terrible cups dripping with blood and fetor descended on Maspic's own eyes. Bellman, who had paused close behind the others, comprehended what was occurring, like one who witnesses the abominations of a nightmare, but is powerless to intervene or flee. He saw the movements of the cupped members. He heard the single atrocious cry that was wrung from Chivers and the swiftly ensuing scream of Maspic. Then, above the heads of his fellows, who still held their useless torches in rigid fingers, the proboscides came toward him, with blood rilling heavily upon their faces, with the somnolent, vigilant, implacable and eyeless shape at their heels, herding them on, restraining them when they tottered at the brink. The three began their second descent of the road that went down forever to a night-bound Avernus. End of The Dweller in the Gulf by Clark Ashton Smith. Vulthoom by Clark Ashton Smith. Weird Tales, September 1935. A weird scientific story of two Earthmen on Mars, a tale of frightful tortures and eerie horrors in the subterranean caverns of the Red Planet, and a doom that menaced Earth. To a cursory observer, it might have seemed that Bob Haines and Paul Septimus Chandler had little enough in common, other than the predicament of being stranded without funds on an alien world. Haines, the third assistant pilot of an ether liner, had been charged with insubordination by his superiors and had been left behind in Ignar, the commercial metropolis of Mars and the port of all space traffic. The charge against him was wholly a matter of personal spite, but so far Haines had not succeeded in finding a new berth, and the month's salary paid to him at parting had been devoured with appalling swiftness by the pirate rates of the Tellurian Hotel. Chandler, a professional writer of interplanetary fiction, had made voyage to Mars to fortify his imaginative talent by a solid groundwork of observation and experience. His money had given out after a few weeks, and fresh supplies, expected from his publisher, had not yet arrived. The two men, apart from their misfortunes, shared an illimitable curiosity concerning all things Martian. Their thirst for the exotic, their proclivity for wandering into places usually avoided by terrestrials, had drawn them together in spite of obvious differences of temperament and had made them fast friends. Trying to forget their worries, they had spent the past day in the queerly piled and huddled maze of old Ignar, called by the Martians Ignarvath, on the eastern side of the great Yahan Canal. Returning at the sunset hour and following the estrade of purple marble beside the water, they had nearly reached the mile-long bridge that would take them back to the modern city, Ignar Luth, in which were the terrestrial consulates and shipping offices and hotels. It was the Martian hour of worship, when the Ihais gather in their roofless temples to implore the return of the passing sun. Like the throbbing of feverish metal pulses, a sound of ceaseless and innumerable gongs punctured the thin air. The incredibly crooked streets were almost empty, and only a few barges, with immense rhomboidal sails of mauve and scarlet, crawled to and fro on the somber green waters. The light waned with visible swiftness behind the top-heavy towers and pagoda-angled pyramids of Ignar Luth. The chill of the coming night began to pervade the shadows of the huge solar gnomons that lined the canal at frequent intervals. The querulous clangors of the gongs died suddenly in Ignarvath and left a weirdly whispering silence. The buildings of the immemorial city bulked enormous upon a sky of blackish emerald that was already thronged with icy stars. A medley of untraceable exotic odors was wafted through the twilight. The perfume was redolent of alien mystery, and it thrilled and troubled the Earthmen, who became silent as they approached the bridge. Feeling the oppression of eerie strangeness that gathered from all sides in the thickening gloom, more deeply than in daylight, they apprehended the muffled breathings and hidden tortuous movements of a life forever inscrutable to the children of other planets. The void between Earth and Mars had been traversed, but who could cross the evolutionary gulf between Earthman and Martian? The people were friendly enough in their taciturn way. They had tolerated the intrusion of terrestrials, had permitted commerce between the worlds. Their languages had been mastered, their history studied by terrene savants, but it seemed that there could be no real interchange of ideas. Their civilization had grown old in diverse complexity before the founding of Lemuria. Its sciences, arts, religions were hoary with inconceivable age, and even the simplest customs were the fruit of alien forces and conditions. At that moment, faced with the precariousness of their situation, Haines and Chandler felt an actual terror of the unknown world that surrounded them with its measureless antiquity. They quickened their paces. The wide pavement that bordered the canal was seemingly deserted, and the light, rayless bridge itself, was guarded only by the 10 colossal statues of Martian heroes that loomed in warlike attitudes before the beginning of the first aerial span. The Earthmen were somewhat startled when a living figure, little less gigantic than the carven images, detached itself from their deepening shadows and came forward with mighty strides. The figure, nearly 10 foot in height, was taller by a full yard than the average eye-high, but presented the familiar conformation of massively bulging chest and bony, many-angled limbs. The head was featured with high flaring ears and pit-like nostrils that narrowed and expanded visibly in the twilight. The eyes were sunken in profound orbits and were wholly invisible, save for tiny reddish sparks that appeared to burn suspended in the sockets of a skull. According to native customs, this bizarre personage was altogether nude, but a kind of circlet around the neck, a flat wire of curiously beaten silver, indicated that he was the servant of some noble lord. Haines and Chandler were astounded, for they had never before seen a Martian of such prodigious stature. The apparition, it was plain, desired to intercept them. He paused before them on the pavement of blockless marble. They were even more amazed by the weirdly booming voice, reverberant as that of some enormous frog, with which he began to address them. In spite of the interminably guttural tone, the heavy slurring of certain vowels and consonants, they realized that the words were those of human language. "My master summons you," bellowed the Colossus. "Your plight is known to him. He will help you liberally in return for a certain assistance which you can render him. Come with me." "This sounds peremptory," murmured Haines. "Shall we go? Probably it's some charitable eye-high prince who's gotten wind of our reduced circumstances. Wonder what the game is." "I suggest that we follow the guide," said Chandler eagerly. "His proposition sounds like the first chapter of a thriller." "All right," said Haines to the towering giant. "Lead us to your master." With strides that were moderated to match those of the Earthmen, the Colossus led them away from the hero-guarded bridge and into the greenish-purple gloom that had inundated Ignar Vath. Beyond the pavement, an alley yawned like a high-mouthed cavern between lightless mansions and warehouses whose broad balconies and jutting roofs were almost conterminous in mid-air. The alley was deserted, and the eye-high moved like an overgrown shadow through the dusk and paused shadow-like in a deep and lofty doorway. Halting at his heels, Chandler and Haines were aware of a shrill metallic stridor made by the opening of the door, which, like all Martian doors, was drawn upward in the manner of a medieval portcullis. Their guide was silhouetted on the saffron light that poured from bosses of radioactive mineral set in the walls and roof of a circular antechamber. He preceded them, according to custom, and following, they saw that the room was unoccupied. The door descended behind them without apparent agency or manipulation. To Chandler, gazing about the windowless chamber, there came the indefinable alarm that is sometimes felt in a closed space. Under the circumstances, there seemed to be no reason to apprehend danger or treachery, but all at once he was filled with a wild longing to escape. Haines, on his part, was wondering rather perplexedly why the inner door was closed and why the master of the house had not already appeared to receive them. Somehow the house impressed him as being uninhabited. There was something empty and desolate in the silence that surrounded them. The eye-high, standing in the center of the bare, unfurnished room, had faced about as if to address the Earthman. His eyes glowered inscrutably from their deep orbits, his mouth opened, showing double rows of snaggy teeth. But no sound appeared to issue from his moving lips, and the notes that he emitted must have belonged to that scale of overtones beyond human audition, of which the Martian voice is capable. No doubt the mechanism of the door had been actuated by similar overtones, and now, as if in response, the entire floor of the chamber, wrought of dark, seamless metal, began to descend slowly, as if dropping into a great pit. Haines and Chandler, startled, saw the saffron lights receding above them. They, together with the giant, were going down into shadow and darkness in a broad circular shaft. There was a ceaseless grating and shrieking of metal, setting their teeth on edge with its insupportable pitch. Like a narrowing cluster of yellow stars, the lights grew dim and small above them. Still their descent continued, and they could no longer discern each other's faces or the face of the eye-high in the ebon blackness through which they fell. Haines and Chandler were beset with 1,000 doubts and suspicions, and they began to wonder if they had been somewhat rash in accepting the eye-high's invitation. "Where are you taking us?" said Haines bluntly. "Does your master live underground?" "We go to my master," replied the Martian with cryptic finality. "He awaits you." The cluster of lights had become a single star, had dwindled and faded, as if in the night of infinity. There was a sense of irredeemable depth, as if they had gone down to the very core of that alien world. The strangeness of their situation filled the Earthmen with increasing disquiet. They had committed themselves to a clueless mystery that began to savor of menace and peril. Nothing was to be learned from their conductor, no retreat was possible, and they were both weaponless. The strident shrieking of metal slowed and sank to a sullen whine. The Earthmen were dazzled by the ruddy brilliance that broke upon them through a circle of slender pillars that had replaced the walls of the shaft. An instant more, while they went down through the flooding light, and then the floor beneath them became stationary. They saw that it was now part of the floor of a great cavern, lit by crimson hemispheres embedded in the roof. The cavern was circular, with passages that ramified from it in every direction, like the spokes of a wheel from the hub. Many Martians, no less gigantic than the guide, were passing swiftly to and fro, as if intent on enigmatic errands. The strange, muted clangors and thunder-like rumblings of hidden machinery throbbed in the air, vibrated in the shaken floor. "What do you suppose we've gotten into?" murmured Chandler. "We must be many miles below the surface. I've never heard of anything like this, except in some of the old eye-high myths. This place might be Ravormos, the Martian underworld, where Vulthoom, the evil god, is supposed to lie asleep for 1,000 years amid his worshippers." The guide had overheard him. "You have come to Ravormos," he boomed portentously. "Vulthoom is awake, and will not sleep again for another 1,000 years. It is he that has summoned you, and I take you now to the chamber of audience." Haines and Chandler, dumbfounded beyond measure, followed the Martian from the strange elevator toward one of the ramifying passages. "There must be some sort of foolery on foot," muttered Haines. "I've heard of Vulthoom too, but he's a mere superstition like Satan. The up-to-date Martians don't believe in him nowadays, though I have heard that there is still a sort of devil cult among the pariahs and low castes. I'll wager that some noble is trying to stage a revolution against the reigning emperor, Psychor, and has established his quarters underground." "That sounds reasonable," Chandler agreed. "A revolutionist might call himself Vulthoom. The trick would be true to the eye-high psychology. They have a taste for high-sounding metaphors and fantastic titles." Both became silent, feeling a sort of awe before the vastness of the cavern world, whose litten corridors reached away on every hand. The surmises they had voiced began to appear inadequate. The improbable was verified. The fabulous had become the factual and was engulfing them more and more. The far mysterious clangers, it seemed, were of preternormal origin. The hurrying giants who passed athwart the chamber with unknown burdens conveyed a sense of supernatural activity and enterprise. Haines and Chandler were both tall and stalwart, but the Martians about them all 9 or 10 feet in height. Some were closer to 11 feet, and all were muscled in proportion. Their faces bore a look of immense, mummy-like age, incongruous with their agility and vigor. Haines and Chandler were led along a corridor from whose arched roof the red hemispheres, doubtless formed of artificially radioactive metal, glared down at intervals like imprisoned suns. Leaping from step to step, they descended a flight of giant stairs, with the Martian striding easily before them. He paused at the open portals of a chamber hewn in the dark and basic adamantine stone. "Enter," I said, and withdrew his bulk to let them pass. The chamber was small but lofty, its roof rising like the interior of spire. Its floor and walls were stained by the bloody violet beams of single hemisphere far up in the narrowing dome. The place was vacant and furnished only with a curious tripod of black metal fixed in the center of the floor. The tripod bore an oval block of crystal, and from this block, as if from a frozen pool, a frozen flower lifted, opening petals of smooth, heavy ivory that received a rosy tinge from the strange light. Block, flower, tripod, it seemed, were the parts of a piece of sculpture. Crossing the threshold, the Earthmen became instantly aware that the throbbing thunders and cave-reverberant clangors had ebbed away in profound silence. It was as if they had entered a sanctuary from which all sound was excluded by a mystic barrier. Tire portals remained open behind them. Their guide, apparently, had withdrawn, but somehow they felt that they were not alone, and it seemed that hidden eyes were peering upon them from the blank walls. Perturbed and puzzled, they stared at the pale flower, noting thin, 7 tongue-like petals that curled softly outward from a perforated heart like a small censer. Chandler began to wonder if it were really carving, or an actual flower that had been mineralized through Martian chemistry. Then, startlingly, a voice appeared to issue from the blossom, a voice incredibly sweet, clear and sonorous, whose tones, perfectly articulate, were neither those of I nor Earthman. "I who speak am the entity known as Vulthoom," said the voice. "Be not surprised or frightened. It is my desire to befriend you in return for a consideration which I hope you will not find impossible. First of all, however, I must explain certain matters that perplex you. No doubt you have heard the popular legends concerning me, and have dismissed them as mere superstitions. Like all myths, they are partly true and partly false. I am neither god nor demon, but a being who came to Mars from another universe in former cycles. Though I am not immortal, my span of life is far longer than that of any creature evolved by the worlds of your solar system. I am governed by alien biologic laws, with periods of alternate slumber and wakefulness that involve centuries. It is virtually true, as the Haines believe, that I sleep for 1,000 years and remain conscious continually for another 1,000. At a time when your ancestors were still the blood brothers of the ape, I fled from my own world to this intercosmic exile, banished by implacable foes. The Martians say that I fell from heaven like a fiery meteor, and the myth interprets the descent of my ether ship. I found a matured civilization, immensely inferior, however, to that from which I came. The kings and hierarchs of the planet would have driven me away, but I gathered a few adherents, arming them with weapons superior to those of Martian science. And after a great war, I established myself firmly and gained other followers. I did not care to conquer Mars, but withdrew to this cavern world in which I have dwelt ever since with my adherents. On these, for their faithfulness, I conferred a longevity that is almost equal to my own. To ensure this longevity, I have also given them the gift of a slumber corresponding to mine. They sleep and wake with me. We have maintained this order of existence for many ages. Seldom have I meddled in the doings of the surface dwellers. They, however, have converted me into an evil god or spirit, though evil, to me, is a word without meaning. I am the possessor of many senses and faculties unknown to you or to the Martians. My perceptions, at will, can be extended over large areas of space, or even time. Thus, I learned your predicament, and I have called you here with the hope of obtaining your consent to a certain plan. To be brief, I have grown weary of Mars, a senile world that draws near to death, and I wish to establish myself in a younger planet. The Earth would serve my purpose well. Even now, my followers are building the new ether ship in which I propose to make the voyage. I do not wish to repeat the experience of my arrival in Mars by landing among a people ignorant of me and perhaps universally hostile. You, being Earthmen, could prepare many of your fellows for my coming, could gather proselytes to serve me. Your reward, and theirs, would be the elixir of longevity, and I have many other gifts, the precious gems and metals that you prize so highly. Also, there are the flowers, whose perfume is more seductive and persuasive than all else. Inhaling that perfumes, you will deem that even gold is worthless in comparison, and having breathed it, you and all others of your kind will serve me gladly. The voice ended, leaving a vibration that thrilled the nerves of the listeners for some moments. It was like the cessation of a sweet, bewitching music with overtones of evil, scarcely to be detected above the subtle melody. It bemused the senses of Haines and Chandler, lulling their astonishment into a sort of dreamy acceptance of the voice and its declarations. Chandler made an effort to throw off the enchantment. "Where are you?" he said, "and how are we to know that you have told us the truth?" "I am near you," said the voice, "but I do not choose at this time to reveal myself. The proof of all that I have stated, however, will be revealed to you in due course. Before you is one of the flowers of which I have spoken. It is not, as you have perhaps surmised, a work of sculpture, but it is an antherlite or fossil blossom brought, with others of the same kind, from the world to which I am native. Though scentless at ordinary temperatures, it yields a perfume under the application of heat. As to the perfume, you must judge for yourselves. The air of the chamber had been neither warm nor cold. Now the Earthmen were conscious of a change, as if hidden fires had been ignited. The warmth seemed to issue from the metal tripod and the block of crystal, beating upon Haines and Chandler like the radiation of some invisible tropic sun. It became ardent, but not insupportable. At the same time, insidiously, the terrestrials began to perceive the perfume, which was like nothing they had ever inhaled. An elusive thread of otherworld sweetness, it curled about their nostrils, deepening slowly but acceleratively to a spicy flood, and seeming to mix a pleasant coolness as of foliage-shaded air with the fervent heat. Chandler was more vividly affected than Haines by the curious hallucinations that followed, though, apart from this differing degree of verisimilitude, their impressions were oddly alike. It seemed to Chandler all at once that the perfume was no longer wholly alien to him, but was something that he had remembered from other times and places. He tried to recall the circumstances of this prior familiarity, and his recollections, drawn up as if from the sealed reservoirs of an old existence, took the form of an actual scene that replaced the cavern chamber about him. Haines was no part of this scene, but had disappeared from his ken, and the roof and walls had vanished, giving place to an open forest of fern-like trees. Their slim, pearly boles and tender frondage swam in a luminous glory, like an Eden filled with a primal daybreak. The trees were tall, but taller still than they were, the flowers that poured down from waving censers of carnal white, an overwhelming and voluptuous perfume. Chandler felt an indescribable ecstasy. It seemed that he had gone back to the fountains of time in the first world, and had drawn into himself inexhaustible life. youth and vigor from the glorious light and fragrance that had steeped his senses to their last nerve. The ecstasy heightened, and he heard a singing that appeared to emanate from the mouths of the blossoms, a singing as of Auris, that turned his blood to a golden philtre brew. In the delirium of his faculties, the sound was identified with the blossom's odor. It rose in giddying rapture insuppressible, and he thought that the very flowers soared like flames, and the trees aspired toward them, and he himself was a blown fire that towered with the singing to attain some ultimate pinnacle of delight. The whole world swept upward in a tide of exultation, and it seemed that the singing turned to articulate sound, and Chandler heard the words, "I am Vulthoom, and thou art mine from the beginning of worlds, and shalt be mine until the end." He awoke under circumstances that might almost have been a continuation of the visionary imagery he had beheld under the influence of the perfume. He lay on a bed of short, curling grass the color of verd antique, with enormous tiger-hued blossoms leaning about him, and a soft brilliance as of amber sunset filling his eyes between the trailing boughs of strange, crimson-fruited trees. Tardily, as he grew cognizant of his surroundings, he realized that the voice of Haines had awakened him, and saw that Haines was sitting near at hand on the curious sward. "Say, aren't you ever corning out of it?" Chandler heard the crisp query, as if through a film of dreams. His thoughts were bewildered, and his memories were oddly mixed with the pseudo-recollections, drawn as if from other lives, that had risen before him in his delirium. It was hard to disentangle the false from the real, but sanity returned to him by degrees, and with it come a feeling of profound exhaustion and nerve-weariness, which warned him that he had sojourned in the spurious paradise of a potent drug. "Where are we now, and how did we get here?" he asked. "As far as I can tell," returned Haines, "we're in a sort of underground garden. Some of those big eye-highs must have brought us here after we succumbed to the perfume. I resisted the influence longer than you did, and I remember hearing the voice of Vulthoom as I went under. The voice said that he would give us 48 hours, terrestrial time, in which to think over his proposition. If we accept, he'll send us back to Ignar with a fabulous sum of money and a supply of those narcotic flowers." Chandler was now fully awake. He and Haines proceeded to discuss their situation, but were unable to arrive at any definite conclusion. The whole affair was no less baffling than extraordinary. An unknown entity, naming himself after the Martian devil, had invited them to become his terrestrial agents or emissaries, apart from the spreading of a propaganda designed to facilitate his advent on Earth. They were to introduce an alien drug that was no less powerful than morphine, cocaine, or marijuana, and, in all likelihood, no less pernicious. "What if we refuse?" said Chandler. "Vulthoom said that it would be impossible to let us return in that case. But he didn't specify our fate, merely hinted that it would be unpleasant." "Well, Haines, we've got to think our way out of this, if we can. I'm afraid that thinking won't help us much. We must be many miles below the surface of Mars, and the mechanism of the elevators, in all probability, is something that no Earthman could ever learn." Before Chandler could offer any comment, one of the giant eye-highs appeared among the trees, carrying two of the curious Martian utensils known as kulpai. These were large platters of semi-metallic earthenware, fitted with removable cups and rotatory carafes, in which an entire meal of liquids and solids could be served. The eye-high set the platters on the ground before Haines and Chandler, and then waited, immobile and inscrutable. The Earthmen, conscious of a ravening hunger, addressed themselves to the foodstuffs, which had been molded or cut into various geometric forms. Though possibly of synthetic origin, the foods were delicious, and the Earthmen consumed them to the last cone and lozenge, and washed them down with a vinous garnet-colored liquor from the carafes. When they had finished, their attendant spoke for the first time. "It is the will of Vulthoom that you should wander throughout Ravormos, and behold the wonders of the caverns. You are at liberty to roam alone and unattended, or, if you prefer, I shall serve you as a guide. My name is Tavoshai, and I am ready to answer any questions that you ask. Also, you may dismiss me at will." Haines and Chandler, after a brief discussion, decided to accept this offer of ciceronage. They followed the eye through the garden, whose extent was hard to determine because of the misty amber luminance that filled it, as if with radiant atoms, giving the impression of unbounded space. The light, they learned from Tavoshai, was emitted by the lofty roof and walls, beneath the action of an electromagnetic force of wavelength shorter even than the cosmic rays. And it possessed all the essential qualities of sunlight. The garden was composed of weird plants and blossoms, many of which were exotic to Mars, and had perhaps been imported from the alien solar system to which Vulthoom was native. Some of the flowers were enormous mats of petals, like 100 orchids joined into one. There were cruciform trees, hung with fantastically long and variegated leaves that resembled heraldic pennants or scrolls of cryptic writing, and others were branched and fruited in outlandish ways. Beyond the garden, they entered a world of open passages and chambered caverns, some of which were filled with machinery, or with storage vats and urns. In others, immense ingots of precious and semi-precious metals were piled, and gigantic coffers spilled their flashing gems as if to tempt the earthman. Most of the machines were in action, though intended, and Haines and Chandler were told that they could run in this manner for centuries or millenaries. Their operation was inexplicable, even to Haines with his expert knowledge of mechanics. Vulthoom and his people had gone beyond the spectrum, and beyond the audible vibrations of sound, and had compelled the hidden forces of the universe to appear and obey them. Everywhere there was a loud beating as of metal pulses, a mutter as of prisoned afrits and servile iron titans. Valves opened and shut with a harsh clangor. There were rooms pillared with strident dynamos, and others where groups of mysteriously levitated spheres were spinning silently, like suns and planets in the void of space. They climbed a flight of stairs, colossal as the steps of the pyramid of Cheops, to a higher level. Haines, in a dreamlike fashion, seemed to remember descending these stairs, and thought they were now nearing the chamber in which he and Chandler had been interviewed by the hidden entity, Vulthoom. Lai was not sure, however, and Tavoshai led them through a series of vast rooms that appeared to serve the purpose of laboratories. In most of these, there were age-old colossi, bending like alchemists over furnaces that burned with cold fire, and retorts that fumed with queer threads and ropes of vapor. One room was untenanted, and was furnished with no apparatus, other than 3 great bottles of clear, uncolored glass, taller than a tall man, and having somewhat the form of Roman amphoras. To all appearances, the bottles were empty, but they were closed with double-handed stoppers that a human being could scarcely have lifted. "What are these bottles?" Chandler asked the guide. "They are the bottles of sleep," said the Eye, with the solemn and sententious air of a lecturer. "Each of them is filled with a rare, invisible gas. When the time comes for the 1,000-year slumber of Vulthoom, the gases are released, and mingling, they pervade the atmosphere of Ravormos, even to the lowest cavern. Inducing sleep for a similar period in us who serve Vulthoom, time no longer exists, and eons are no more than instants for the sleepers, and they awaken only at the hour of Vulthoom's awakening." Haines and Chandler, filled with curiosity, were prompted to ask many questions, but most of these were answered vaguely and ambiguously by Tavoshai, who seemed eager to continue his ciceronage through other and ulterior parts of Ravormos. He could tell them nothing about the chemical nature of the gases, and Vulthoom himself, if the veracity of Tavoshai could be trusted, was a mystery even to his own followers, most of whom had never beheld him in person. Tavoshai conducted the Earthmen from the room of bottles, and down a long straight cavern, wholly deserted, where a rumbling and pounding as of innumerable engines came to meet them. The sound broke upon them like a Niagara of evil thunders when they emerged finally in a sort of pillared gallery that surrounded a mile-wide gulf, illumined by the terrible flaring of tongued fires that rose incessantly from its depths. It was as if they looked down into some infernal circle of angry light and tortured shadow. Far beneath, they saw a colossal structure of curved and glittering girders, like the strangely articulated bones of a metal behemoth outstretched along the bottom of the pit. Around it, furnaces belched like the flaming mouths of dragons. Tremendous cranes went up and down perpetually with a motion as of long-necked plesiosaurs, and the figures of giants, red as laboring demons, moved through the sinister glare. "They build the ether ship in which Vulthoom will voyage to the Earth," said Tavoshai. "When all is ready, the ship will blast its way to the surface by means of atomic disintegrators. The very stone will melt before it like vapor. Ignar Luth, which lies directly above, will be consumed as if the central fires of the planet had broken loose." Haines and Chandler, appalled, could offer no rejoinder. More and more they were stunned by the mystery and magnitude, the terror and menace of this unsuspected cavern world. Here, they felt, a malign power, armed with untold arcana of science, was plotting some baleful conquest. A doom that might involve the peopled worlds of the system was being incubated in secrecy and darkness. They, it seemed, were helpless to escape and give warning, and their own fate was shadowed by insoluble gloom. A gust of hot metallic vapor, mounting from the abyss, burned corrosively in their nostrils as they peered from the gallery's verge. Ill and giddy, they drew back. "What lies beyond this gulf?" Chandler inquired, when his sickness had passed. "This gallery leads to other caverns, little used, which conduct on the dry bed of an ancient underground river. This riverbed, running for many miles, emerges in a sunken desert far below sea level and lying to the west of Ignar." The Earthmen started at this information, which seemed to offer them a possible avenue of escape. Both, however, thought it well to dissemble their interest. Pretending fatigue, they asked the Ihai to lead them to some chamber in which they could rest a while and discuss Vulthoom's proposition at leisure. Tavoshai, professing himself at their service in all ways, took them to a small room beyond the laboratories. It was a sort of bedchamber, with 2 tiers of couches along the walls. These couches, from their length, were evidently designed to accommodate the giant Martians. Here Haines and Chandler were left alone by Tavoshai, who had tacitly inferred that his presence was no longer needed. "Well," said Chandler, "it looks as if there were a chance of escape if we can only reach that riverbed. I took careful note of the corridors we followed on our return from the gallery. It should be easy enough, unless we are being watched without our knowledge. The only trouble is it's too easy. But anyway, we can try. Anything would be better than waiting around like this. After what we've seen and heard, I'm beginning to believe that Vulthoom really is the devil, even though he doesn't claim to be. Those 10-foot Ihais give me the creeps," said Chandler. "I can readily believe they are 1,000,000 years old, or thereabouts. Enormous longevity would account for their size and stature. Most animals that survive beyond the normal term of years become gigantic, and it stands to reason that these Martian men would develop in a similar fashion." It was a simple matter to retrace their route to the pillared gallery that encircled the great abyss. For most of the distance, they had only to follow a main corridor, and the sound of the rumbling engineries alone would have guided them. They met no one in the passages, and the Ihais that they saw through open portals in laboratory rooms were deeply intent on enigmatic chemistries. "I don't like this," muttered Haines. "It's too good to be true. I'm not so sure of that. Perhaps it simply hasn't occurred to Vulthoom and his followers that we might try to escape. After all, we know nothing about their psychology." Keeping close to the inner wall behind the thick pillars, they followed the long, slowly winding gallery on the right hand. It was lit only by the shuddering reflection of the tall flames in the pit below. Moving thus, they were hidden from the view of the laboring giants, if any of these had happened to look upward. Poisonous vapors were blown toward them at intervals, and they felt the hellish heat of the furnaces, and the clangors of welding, the thunder of obscure machineries, beat upon them as they went with reverberations that were like hammer blows. By degrees they rounded the gulf, and came at last to its further side, where the gallery curved backward in its return toward the entrance corridor. Here, in the shadows, they discerned the unlit mouth of a large cavern that radiated from the gallery. This cavern, they surmised, would lead them toward the sunken riverbed of which Tavo-Shai had spoken. Haines, luckily, carried a small pocket flash, and he turned its ray into the cavern, revealing a straight corridor with numerous minor intersections. Night and silence seemed to swallow them at a gulp, and the clangors of the toiling titans were quickly and mysteriously muted as they hurried along the empty hall. The roof of the corridor was fitted with metal hemispheres, now dark and rayless, that had formerly served to illuminate it in the same fashion as the other halls of Ravormos. A fine dust was stirred by the feet of the earthmen as they fled, and soon the air grew chill and losing the mild and somewhat humid warmth of the central caverns. It was plain, as Tavo-Shai had told them, that these outer passages were seldom used or visited. It seemed that they went on for a mile or more in that Tartarian corridor. Then the walls began to straighten, the floor roughened and fell steeply. There were no more cross passages, and hope quickened in the earthmen as they saw plainly that they had gone beyond the artificial caverns into a natural tunnel. The tunnel soon widened, and its floor became a series of shelf formations. By means of these they descended into a profound abyss that was obviously the river channel of which Tavo-Shai had told them. The small flashlight barely sufficed to reveal the full extent of this underground waterway, in which there was no longer even a trickle of its prehistoric flood. The bottom, deeply eroded and riffled with sharp boulders, was more than 100 yards wide, and the roof arched into gloom irresoluble. Exploring the bottom tentatively for a little distance, Haines and Chandler determined by its gradual falling the direction in which the stream had flowed. Following this downwards course, they set out resolutely, praying that they would find no impassable barriers, no precipices of former cataracts to impede or prevent their egress in the desert. Apart from the danger of pursuit, they apprehended no other difficulties than these. The obscure windings of the bottom brought them first to one side and then to the other as they groped along. In places the cavern widened, and they came to far recessive beaches, terraced and marked by the ebbing waters. High up on some of the beaches, there were singular formations resembling a type of mammoth fungi grown in caverns beneath the modern canals. These formations, in the shape of Herculean clubs, arose often to a height of 3 feet or more. Haines, impressed by their metallic sparkling beneath the light as he flashed it upon them, conceived a curious idea. Though Chandler protested against the delay, he climbed the shelving to examine a group of them more closely, and found, as he had suspected, that they were not living growths, but were petrified and heavily impregnated with minerals. He tried to break one of them loose, but it resisted all his tugging. However, by hammering it with a loose fragment of stone, he succeeded in fracturing the base of the club, and it toppled over with an iron tinkling. The thing was very heavy, with a mace-like swelling at the upper end, and would make a substantial weapon in case of need. He broke off a second club for Chandler, and thus armed, they resumed their flight. It was impossible to calculate the distance that they covered. The channel turned and twisted, it pitched abruptly in places, and was often broken into ledges that glittered with alien ores, or were stained with weirdly brilliant oxides of azure, vermilion, and yellow. The men floundered ankle-deep in pits of sable sand, or climbed laboriously over dam-like barricades of rusty boulders, huge as piled menhirs. Ever and anon, They found themselves listening feverishly for any sound that would betoken pursuit. But silence brimmed the Cimmerian channel, troubled only by the clatter and crunch of their own footsteps. At last, with incredulous eyes, they saw before them the dawning of a pale light in the further depths. Arch by dismal arch, like the throat of Avernus lit by nether fires, the enormous cavern became visible. For one exultant moment, they thought that they were nearing the channel mouth, but the light grew with an eerie and startling brilliance, like the flaming of furnaces rather than sunshine falling into a cave. Implacable, it crept along the walls and bottom, and dimmed the ineffectual beam of Haines' torch as it fell on the dazzled earthmen. Ominous, incomprehensible, the light seemed to watch and threaten. They stood amazed and hesitant, not knowing whether to go on or retreat. Then, from the flaming air, a voice spoke as if in gentle reproof, the sweet, sonorous voice of Vulthoom. "Go back as you came, O earthlings. None may leave Ravormos without my knowledge or against my will. Behold, I have sent my guardians to escort you." The lit air had been empty to all seeming, and the riverbed was peopled only by the grotesque masses and squat shadows of boulders. Now, with the ceasing of the voice, Haines and Chandler saw before them, at a distance of 10 feet, the instant apparition of two creatures that were comparable to nothing in the whole known zoology of Mars or Earth. They rose from the rocky bottom to the height of giraffes, with shortish legs that were vaguely similar to those of Chinese dragons, and elongated spiral necks like the middle coils of great anacondas. Their heads were triple-faced, and they might have been the Tremerti of some infernal world. It seemed that each face was eyeless, with tongue-shapen flames issuing voluminously from deep orbits beneath the slanted brows. Flames also poured in a ceaseless vomit from the gaping gargoyle mouths. From the head of each monster, a triple comb of vermilion flared aloft in sharp serrations, glowing terribly, and both of them were bearded with crimson scrolls. Their necks and arching spines were fringed with sword-long blades that diminished into rows of daggers on the tapering tails, and their whole bodies, as well as this fearsome armament, appeared to burn as if they had just issued from a fiery furnace. A palpable heat emanated from these hellish chimeras, and the earthmen retreated hastily before the flying splotches, like the blown tatters of a conflagration that broke loose from their ever-jetting eye flames and mouth flames. "My God, these monsters are supernatural!" cried Chandler, shaken and appalled. Haines, though palpably startled, was inclined to a more orthodox explanation. "There must be some sort of television behind this," he maintained, "though I can't imagine how it's possible to project three-dimensional images and also create the sensation of heat. I had an idea somehow that our escape was being watched." He picked up a heavy fragment of metallic stone and heaved it at one of the glowing chimeras. Aimed unerringly, the fragment struck the frontal brow of the monster and seemed to explode in a shower of sparks at the moment of impact. The creature flared and swelled prodigiously, and a fiery hissing became audible. Haines and Chandler were driven back by a wave of scorching heat, and their wardens followed them pace by pace on the rough bottom. Abandoning all hope of escape, they returned toward Ravormos, dogged by the monsters as they toiled through yielding sand and over the ledges and riffles. Reaching the point where they had descended into the river channel, they found its upper stretches guarded by two more of these terrific dragons. There was no other recourse than to climb the lofty shelves into the acclivitous tunnel. Weary with their long flight, and enervated by a dull despair, they found themselves again in the outer hall, with two of their guardians now preceding them like an escort of infernal honor. Both were stunned by a realization of the awful and mysterious powers of Vulthoom, and even Haines had become silent, though his brain was still busy with a futile and desperate probing. Chandler, more sensitive, suffered all the chills and terrors that his literary imagination could inflict upon him under the circumstances. They came at length to the columned gallery that circled the vast abyss. Midway in this gallery, the chimeras who preceded the Earthmen turned upon them suddenly with a fearsome belching of flames. And as they paused in their intimidation, the two behind continued to advance toward them with a hissing as of satanic salamanders. In that narrowing space, the heat was like a furnace blast, and the columns afforded no shelter. From the gulf below, where the Martian titans toiled perpetually, a stupefying thunder rose to assail them at the same time, and noxious fumes were blown toward them in writhing coils. "Looks as if they're going to drive us into the gulf," Haines panted, as he sought to draw breath in the fiery air. He and Chandler reeled before the looming monsters, and even as he spoke, two more of these hellish apparitions flamed into being at the gallery's verge, as if they had risen from the gulf to render impossible that fatal plunge which alone could have offered an escape from the others. Half swooning, the Earthmen were dimly aware of a change in the menacing chimeras. The flaming bodies dulled and shrank, and darkened the heat lessened. The fires died down in the mouths and eye pits. At the same time, the creatures drew closer, fawning loathsomely and revealing whitish tongues and eyeballs of jet. The tongues seemed to divide. They grew paler. They were like flower petals that Haines and Chandler had seen somewhere. The breath of the chimeras, like a soft gale, was upon the faces of the Earthmen, and the breath was a cool and spicy perfume that they had known before. The narcotic perfume that had overcome them following their audience with the hidden master of Ravormos. Moment by moment, the monsters turned to prodigious blossoms. The pillars of the gallery became gigantic trees in a glamour of primal dawn. The thunders of the pit were lulled to a far-off sighing as of gentle seas on Edenic shores. The teeming terrors of Ravormos, the threat of a shadowy doom, were as things that had never been. Haines and Chandler, oblivious, were lost in the paradise of the unknown drug. Haines, awakening darkly, found that he lay on the stone floor in the circling colonnade. He was alone, and the fiery chimeras had vanished. The shadows of his opiate swoon were roughly dissipated by the clangors that still mounted from the neighboring gulf. With growing consternation and horror, he recalled everything that had happened. He arose giddily to his feet, peering about in the semi-twilight of the gallery for some trace of his companion. The petrified fungus club that Chandler had carried, as well as his own weapon, were lying where they had fallen from the fingers of the overpowered men. But Chandler was gone, and Haines shouted aloud with no other response than had eerily prolonged echoes of the deep arcade. Impelled by an urgent feeling that he must find Chandler without delay, he recovered his heavy mace and started along the gallery. It seemed that the weapon could be of little use against the preternatural servants of Vulthoom, but somehow the metallic weight of the bludgeon reassured him. Nearing the great corridor that ran to the core of Ravormos, Haines was overjoyed when he saw Chandler coming to meet him. Before he could call out a cheery greeting, he heard Chandler's voice. "Hello, Bob. This is my first televisual appearance in tridimensional form. Pretty good, isn't it? I'm in the private laboratory of Vulthoom, and Vulthoom has persuaded me to accept his proposition. As soon as you've made up your mind to do likewise, we'll return to Ignar with full instructions regarding our terrestrial mission and funds amounting to $1 million each. Think it over, and you'll see that there's nothing else to do. When you've decided to join ins, follow the main corridor through Ravormos, and Tavoshai will meet you and bring you into the laboratory." At the conclusion of this astounding speech, the figure of Chandler, without seeming to wait for any reply from Haines, stepped lightly to the gallery's verge and floated out among the wreathing vapors. There, smiling upon Haines, it vanished like a phantom. To say that Haines was thunderstruck would be putting it feebly indeed. In all verisimilitude, the figure and voice had been those of the flesh-and-blood Chandler. He felt an eerie chill before the thaumaturgy of Vulthoom, which could bring about a projection so veridical as to deceive him in this manner. He was shocked and horrified beyond measure by Chandler's capitulation, but somehow it did not occur to him that any imposture had been practiced. "That devil has gotten him," thought Haines. "But I'd never have believed it. I didn't think he was that kind of a fellow at all." Sorrow, anger, bafflement and amazement filled him alternately as he strode along the gallery, nor, as he entered the inner hall, was he able to decide on any clearly effective course of action. To yield, as Chandler had avowedly done, was unthinkably repugnant to him. If he could see Chandler again, perhaps he could persuade him to change his mind and resume an unflinching opposition to the alien entity. It was a degradation and a treason to humankind for any Earthman to lend himself to the more than doubtful schemes of Vulthoom. Apart from the projected invasion of Earth and the spread of the strange, subtle narcotic, there was the ruthless destruction of Ignarluth that would occur when Vulthoom's ether vessel should blast its way to the planets. Surface, it was his duty, and Chandler's, to prevent all this if prevention were humanly possible. Somehow, they, or he alone if necessary, must stem the cavern-incubated menace. Bluntly honest himself, there was no thought of temporizing even for an instant. Still carrying the mineraloid club, he strode on for several minutes, his brain preoccupied with the dire problem, but powerless to arrive at any solution. Through a habit of observation, more or less automatic with the veteran space pilot, he peered through the doorways of the various rooms that he passed, where the couples and retorts of a foreign chemistry were tended by age-old colossi. Then, without premeditation, he came to the deserted room in which were the three mighty receptacles that Tavo-Shide called the bottles of sleep. He remembered what the Ihai had said concerning their contents. In a flash of desperate inspiration, Haines boldly entered the room, hoping that he was not under the surveillance of Vulthoom at the moment. There was no time for reflection or other delay if he were to execute the audacious plan that had occurred to him. Taller than his head, with the swelling contours of great amphoras and seemingly empty, the bottles glimmered in the still light. Like the phantom of a bulbous giant, he saw his own distorted image in the upward curving glass as he neared the foremost one. There was but one thought, one resolution in his mind. Whatever the cost, he must smash the bottles, whose released gases would pervade Ravormos and plunge the followers of Vulthoom, if not Vulthoom himself, into a 1,000-year term of slumber. He and Chandler, no doubt, would be doomed to share the slumber, and for them, unfortified by the secret elixir of immortality, there would be, in all likelihood, no awakening. But under the circumstances, it was better so, and, by the sacrifice, 1,000 years of grace would be accorded to the two planets. Now was his opportunity, and it seemed improbable that there would ever be another one. He lifted the petrified fungus mace. He swung it back in a swift arc and struck with all his strength at the bellying glass. There was a gong-like clangor, sonorous and prolonged, and radiating cracks appeared from top to bottom of the huge receptacle. At the second blow, it broke inward with a shrill, appalling sound that was almost an articulate shriek, and Haines's face was fanned for an instant by a cool breath, gentle as a woman's sigh. Holding his breath to avoid the inhalation of the gas, he turned to the next bottle. It shattered at the first stroke, and again he felt a soft sighing that followed upon the cleavage. A voice of thunder seemed to fill the room as he raised his weapon to assail the third bottle. "Fool! You have doomed yourself and your fellow Earthmen by this deed." The last words mingled with the crash of Haines's final stroke. A tomb-like silence followed, and the far-off muted rumble of enginery seemed to ebb and recede before it. The Earthman stared for a moment at the riven bottles, and then, dropping the useless remnant of his mace, which had been shattered into several fragments, he fled from the chamber. Drawn by the noise of breakage, a number of Ihais had appeared in the hall. They were running about in an aimless, unconcerted manner, like mummies impelled by a failing galvanism. None of them tried to intercept the Earthmen, Whether the slumber induced by the gases would be slow or swift in its coming, Haines could not surmise. The air of the caverns was unchanged as far as he could tell. There was no odor, no perceptible effect on his breathing. But already, as he ran, he felt a slight drowsiness, and a thin veil appeared to weave itself on all his senses. It seemed that faint vapors were forming in the corridor, and there was a touch of insubstantiality in the very walls. His flight was without definite goal or purpose. Like a dreamer in a dream, he felt little surprise when he found himself lifted from the floor and borne along through mid-air in an inexplicable levitation. It was as if he were caught in a rushing stream, or were carried on invisible clouds. The doors of 100 secret rooms, the mouths of 100 mysterious halls, flew swiftly past him, and he saw in brief glimpses the colossi that lurched and nodded with the ever-spreading slumber as they went to and fro on strange errands. Then, dimly, he saw that he had entered the high vaulted room that enshrined the fossil flower on its tripod of crystal and black metal. A door opened in the seamless stone of the further wall as he hurtled toward it. An instant more, while he seemed to fall downward through a nether chamber beyond, among prodigious masses of unnameable machines. Upon a revolving disk that droned infernally, then he was deposited on his feet, with the whole chamber righting itself about him, and the disk towering before him. The disk had now ceased to revolve, but the air still throbbed with its hellish vibration. The place was like a mechanical nightmare, but amid its confusion of glittering coils and dynamos, Haines beheld the form of Chandler, lashed upright with metal cords to a rack-like frame. Near him, in a still and standing posture, was the giant Tavo-Shai, and immediately in front of him there reclined an incredible thing whose further portions and members wound away to an indefinite distance amid the machinery. Somehow the thing was like a gigantic plant, with innumerable roots, pale and swollen, that ramified from a bulbular hole. This bowl, half hidden from view, was topped with a vermilion cup like a monstrous blossom, and from the cup there grew an elfin figure, pearly-hued, and formed with exquisite beauty and symmetry, a figure that turned its Lilliputian face toward Haines and spoke in the sounding voice of Vulthoom. "You have conquered for the time, but I bear no rancor toward you. I blame my own carelessness." To Haines, the voice was like a far-off thunder heard by one who is half asleep. With halting effort, lurching as if he were about to fall, he made his way toward Chandler. Wan and haggard, with a look that puzzled Haines dimly, Chandler gazed upon him from the metal frame without speaking. "I smashed the bottles." Haines heard his own voice with a feeling of drowsy unreality. "It seemed the only thing to do, since you had gone over to Vulthoom." "But I hadn't consented," Chandler replied slowly. "It was all a deception, to trick you into consenting. And they were torturing me because I wouldn't give in." Chandler's voice trailed away, and it seemed that he could say no more. Subtly, the pain and haggardness began to fade from his features, as if erased by the gradual oncoming of slumber. Haines, laboriously trying to comprehend through his own drowsiness, perceived an evil-looking instrument, like a many-pointed metal goad, which drooped from the fingers of Tavo-Shai. From the arc of needle-like tips, there fell a ceaseless torrent of electric sparks. The bosom of Chandler's shirt had been torn open, and his skin was stippled with tiny blue-black marks from chin to diaphragm, marks that formed a diabolic pattern. Haines felt a vague, unreal horror. Through the lether that closed upon his senses more and more, he became aware that Vulthoom had spoken, and after an interval, it seemed that he understood the meaning of the words. "All my methods of persuasion have failed, but it matters little. I shall yield myself to slumber, though I could remain awake if I wished, defying the gases through my superior science and vital power. We shall all sleep soundly, and 1,000 years are no more than a single night to my followers and me. For you, whose life term is so brief, they will become eternity. Soon I shall awaken and resume my plans of conquest. And you, who dared to interfere, will lie beside me then, as a little dust, and the dust will be swept away." The voice ended, and it seemed that the elfin being began to nod in the monstrous vermilion cup. Haines and Chandler saw each other with growing, wavering dimness, as if through a grey mist that had risen between them. There was silence everywhere, as if the Tartarian engineries had fallen still, and the Titans had ceased their labour. Chandler relaxed on the torture frame, and his eyelids drooped. Haines tottered, fell, and lay motionless. Tavoshai, still clutching his sinister instrument, reposed like a mummied giant. Slumber, like a silent sea, had filled the caverns of Ravormos. End of Vulthoom by Clark Ashton Smith. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.